Hello everyone, welcome to What If Yuji Itadori Tried to Save Satoru Gojo during the Shibuya Incident Part 1. Before we start, please go support Dragneel Slayer for writing that awesome fanfic. This is the translated version I made. There will be some mistaken character's gender, but of course Yuji is a male. Each one is created to follow an established path, a destiny, a tool of those above. And beings like curses can become the manifestation of all of humanity's evil. Yuji Itadori is a first-year sorcerer at the Tokyo Metropolitan Technical College of Magic with 3 months standing, after having ingested one of the fingers of the legendary Ryuman Sukuna, the king of curses. October 31, 2018, the Shibuya incident leaves hundreds of dead, both humans and sorcerers. Satoru Gojo is imprisoned under Kenjaku's influence. The bridges for the sacrifice game are established, and the Elder's rules frame Yuji and his companions as traitors. November 1, 2018. Yuji Itadori and Choso make contact with Naoya Zenin and Yuta Okkotsu. And something awakens in the boy. Chapter 1. Buildings had cracks and deformed facades. Glass flooded the streets, and vehicles were completely abandoned, parked in the middle of the street. What was once a beautiful, bustling neighborhood now resembled a war zone, completely devoid of pedestrians or people in the immediate vicinity, giving the appearance of an abandoned city. Shibuya had been a bustling neighborhood until 24 hours ago. Its buildings were a near-carbon representation of what Times Square was to Americans, like its twin brother. Or at least, it was before D-Day, the incident that changed Japan for better or worse, a day that marked the history of the country and its inhabitants. Despite the destruction and chaos, two people were walking among debris, abandoned vehicles, and bodies lying on the asphalt, showing fatal wounds likely from a confrontation. Many, or most, of the people wore similar clothing with a similar detail. A button depicting what appeared to be a small vortex like a whirlpool, which seemed to be representative of these people, as if it were some kind of symbol. The uniforms were dark, both the women's and men's, and some seemed to have distinctive features that made them different from those of their male counterparts. Of the two people still alive, the younger one appeared to be wearing the same uniform as the deceased. It was a male uniform with a red hood matching the sneakers that finished the uniform, making it its distinctive feature. Like his companions, this boy also wore the vortex symbol on one of the many buttons on his uniform sweatshirt. The other man looked a bit older, with his hair pulled back in two buns and bangs falling haphazardly over his forehead. Across the bridge of his nose, a black tattoo-like mark stood out on his face, giving the man a much more neglected and dispirited appearance, adding to the dark circles under his eyes, which cast a disdainful and lackluster look. We should move on, find some of the others. The younger man had messy, light pink hair. A scar ran across his face as if someone had tried to cut him in two, which they had. Another small scar was present on the right side of his mouth, at the bottom. A previous cut had left this mark on the boy's mouth. Where to look? That's the question. Both of them wore very serious expressions. The events that led Shibuya to its current state had revolved around the brown-haired boy, while the dark-haired man was pushed and manipulated into participating. He learned that only at the end of the events, when there was little he could do to fix things, and he could only accept it. The boy pressed his lips into a thin line that nearly made his mouth disappear from his face. Seriousness was warring with anger and sadness in his brown eyes, which had gone over that case hundreds of times, etching the images in his mind every chance he got. It was a punishment. One specifically meant for him, and no one else could feel or appreciate it, especially since he was the one responsible for that genocide. The priority is to rescue Gojo-sensei. Shibuya had wrapped himself in a dark cloak. The curses had grown and grown in power, roaming the streets where there should have been people. With him, all of this can be reversed. Brother. I'll help you find Satoru Gojo. The Shibuya incident not only revolved around the young man, but was also the precursor to the downfall and confinement of the man who had maintained balance since birth. Satoru Gojo, the strongest sorcerer in the current era and the culprit behind the Shibuya incident in the first place. Various special grade curses had gathered to confront Gojo and eventually imprison him in the confinement prison. And if he wasn't locked up, if that guy hadn't locked him up, I probably would have killed him. Mockery, evil, and darkness. The voice echoed in the boy's head, causing him to press his lips together even tighter until they turned almost white, the color draining away. I've already killed all of these. One more, too bad you weren't there to see it, kid. Less than a year earlier, the boy had been recruited by Satoru Gojo to be trained as a sorcerer, though his entry into the school was not due to family or ordinary circumstances. Due to a cursed object the boy ingested, he gained a second personality within his body, giving life to a terrifying being who had lived during the Heian era tormenting people. This entity was known as the King of Curses. Ryuman Sukuna. Sukuna had been the main cause of death for most of the sorcerers and people who were inside the veil when he performed his ritual. Of course, this blame would be placed on his vessel, since it was the vessel of Sukuna and the one who carried the demon inside it. And it might be for the best. If he was killed with Sukuna's fingers inside his body, Sukuna would finally be eliminated from the world, something that couldn't be achieved 1,000 years ago. Although, of course, Sukuna wasn't going to let that happen easily, and he wouldn't allow himself to be killed without completing his own objective and being deprived of playing with his vessel. Currently, the boy who carried Sukuna with him had been sentenced to the death penalty in order to get rid of Sukuna once and for all, and all those fingers that the boy ingested at the time to contain their power. It was the best course of action. However, for the boy there was still something to do before he could die taking Sukuna with him, and that was to rescue his master, who was in the hands of the man who had orchestrated everything that had happened. Noritashi Kamo, or rather the one who took the body of the Kamo's ancestor. Kenjaku. Kenjaku was the current leader of the curse group that created chaos in Shibuya. The current perpetrator of Gojo's confinement and the main cause of the deaths of several sorcerers and just as many civilians at the hands of the curses that served him. He was, after all, the cause of the worst possible situations in the history of sorcery, and it was all part of his plan. It wasn't as if the boy would forgive them, neither Kenjaku nor Sukuna, although the latter would die when he did, whenever and however he wanted. Having become his vessel, he was still bound to his body. Probably if the elders had executed him, many sorcerers would still be alive, and their teacher wouldn't be dead. In order to find Gojo-sensei, we must find that Kenjaku who has occupied the body of sensei's friend. And to find that man, we have to find and plan something together with Fushiguro, although I don't know where he is right now. The best option for us is to find my partner. That was the best plan he could think of and the best way to achieve their goal. Freeing Professor Gojo from the prison where he'd been confined. However, would it be easy? They'd likely have to face curses on the way to Kenjaku and people associated with him along the way, just as had happened in Shibuya. It happened with that voodoo girl. I think she's dead, right? Keha. Sukuna was a constantly annoying presence, like a mosquito that pecked him constantly and too passionately to leave him alone. And it wasn't just his voice that was annoying. The memories the curse played within his head were all about the Shibuya incident, about the deaths of those who stained his hands with blood. If he hadn't allowed Sukuna to leave when he ingested all those fingers, many of the dead sorcerers and civilians would probably be alive now. Which one of you is Yuji Itadori? Sukuna's container. They both nodded. Standing on the edge, a young man watched them both with a smug, self-centered look and a mocking smile. That boy had short blonde hair with darker tips. His eyes were elongated and slanted, just like his eyebrows, and his clothing seemed slightly traditional if someone looked at it twice. A kimono was worn over a long-sleeved, long-collared shirt. Or better yet, both the youngest and the oldest felt a weight on their shoulders. Their faces showed surprise. Tell me where Fushiguro is. The pink-haired boy jumped to the right and the dark-haired man jumped to the left, leaving the blonde man in his place. He only blinked, but his lips showed pure arrogance and a smile. They had felt fear, or at least that's how he saw it. Fear is something that dulls the senses. It's good that you see someone who surpasses you in fear. The man's eyes moved between the brown-haired boy and the black-haired boy. His tongue licked his lower lip and then he proceeded to point at the boy. You're Itadori. Yuji Itadori braced himself. His muscles braced, his senses screamed. Just as he had disappeared from the side of the road, the blonde man vanished from the student's side again, leaving no trace for the boy to follow. However, his senses screamed and surprise appeared on the attacker's face when he tried to grab the boy's head with his bare hands. To generate such surprise, Yuji had ducked his body following his own instincts, or, rather, his body forced him to duck to avoid the crushing of his head. That movement shocked the attacker for several seconds. He hadn't expected the boy to evade his blow so easily. Or had he held back himself so as not to inflict too much pain on the brat? No, that was impossible. The blonde man then jumped back, evading Yuji's right arm, who had tried to hit his chin with a fist wrapped in cursed energy, probably with the same intention as him. To knock him down with a single blow. I must admit I didn't expect that. However, this is over, Sukuna's vessel. As the next head of the Zenin clan, I must eliminate the mistake from this world and curry favor with the elders. It's not that I care about your story. Tense muscles had stiffened his movements. He bent his leg slightly to let his body fall into a simple position and not put all his weight on his back. I'm not going to let you go after Fushiguro. Will you finally do something for yourself, kid? Kejijij. Yuji ignored that mocking question and pushed it to the back of his mind. He couldn't get distracted right now when someone was trying to take his life like it was nothing. Oh? Is that what you think? What can you win against me, kid? Let's see how long the container can hold its contents, shall we? Yuji leaped forward, leaving a small crack in the ground. He drew his right arm back and executed the divergent punch, intending to strike his target. But said target was much faster than the boy's body was accustomed to and traveled the distance before he could complete the journey, slamming his knee directly into Yuji's stomach. The boy was thrown backward and grunted as his back hit the wall, seconds later creating a small crater that shook the bridge they were fighting under. "I have to admit, that body's tough," the man pointed out as Yuji stood up. "It took a hit at that speed. Penetrating blood. Like an arrow, blood shot from Yuji's partner's hands, intending to penetrate his opponent's body and pierce through him. Unsurprisingly, the dark-haired man was overpowered by the blonde when the latter dodged the attack and struck him directly in the chin, sending him tumbling backward. "Are you serious? Is that all? For this, you're better off dead." A chill ran down the blonde man's spine. He turned his face and looked over his shoulder. Two yellow eyes stared back at him, as if they came from a beast, a predator. "Hey, don't threaten me, okay?" The shadow stretched out to cover the attacker himself. The blonde-haired sorcerer frowned, denying the feeling. "I'll break every bone in your body, then." Yuji struck again with a divergent fist. This time, showing his confidence, the blonde only took a step back, which was a mistake. The divergent fist was two punches in one. One from the cursed energy envelope and another, a few seconds later, caused by the difference between the punch and the cursed energy, the phase difference between the two. Not knowing anything about this, the blonde wizard felt something hit him and seconds later, he was thrown straight into a car. The car's windows shattered and the body was dented. "Brother?" Yuji's eyes were unfocused at that moment and the brunette could see his chest heaving frantically, his brother holding a hand right over his heart. He seemed to be hyperventilating, choking on his own oxygen. It was as if he were trying to gasp for air. My chest is burning like hell." Sweat began to bead on the teenager's forehead, dripping down his temples and falling to the ground from the edges of his face. "I feel so hot, Choso." The steam escaped as if he were a locomotive, as if he were being fed coal and were a locomotive. Even Choso watched this with a small fascination. "I don't know what you're doing, Sukuna's container. But this isn't the time to play games. Brother." Toso, as Yuji's older brother, tried to protect him. But the attacker's speed was greater than the special grade curse expected and he couldn't reach him. 22, 23, 24. The blonde sorcerer's eyes widened. A shadow of a fist flashed across the man's face. A microsecond later, the man was knocked back by Yuji's divergent fist and slammed into the ground with tremendous force. My body moved on its own, the young man turned toward the curse. The attacker had slowly begun to stand up, his face bloodied by the blow showing. I don't know what happened, but I saw it. I saw him move. "Don't buck with me." The piercing scream made Choso and Yuji look at the Zenin member. "Me, Naoya Zenin, beaten by a piece of shit like you? I have to kill you now." "You broke the toy, Yuji. Are you going to break it even more?" Yuji didn't respond to his tenant. With his fists wrapped in cursed energy, he faced Naoya Zenin, supported by his older brother, Choso. "Come on. I have a little more where that came from." Chapter 2. There was a vast difference between the two sorcerers and it was all too evident. So evident that Yuji Itadori himself should be worried about his own death. However, something strange was happening to the young sorcerer. His body, in his words, had begun to heat up and his breathing had become hyperventilated, as if constantly seeking oxygen to fill his lungs every few seconds, always appearing tired and panting in the eyes of Naoya Zenin, his adversary. For his part, Naoya was surprised by two things. The first was the resistance of Sukuna's container to his blows, which weren't exactly weak. He had hit the teenager's stomach and sent him crashing against the wall. And what was his response? He hit back a few seconds later without showing a single scratch or bruise visible to his eyes, as if he hadn't received the blow from his side. The second was precisely the divergent fist the blow Yuji had effectively connected, overcoming his cursed ritual. How, a first-year apprentice, had deduced the function of his innate technique and surpassed 24 frames. It was unheard of. Even far more experienced sorcerers had failed to see that weakness or overcome it. And that was a blow to his pride. For someone as proud and self-important as Naoya, being overtaken by the Sorcerer Society's mistake was too much for him to bear and it filled him with resentment and a thirst for revenge against a teenager. But it was revenge for the wound to his pride, not because Yuji had decided to do anything to him. Because of this, Naoya's eyes seemed to have darkened and filled with an enormous negative feeling. A feeling that Choso sensed belonged to a trauma inherent to the sorcerer, associated with some kind of low self-esteem. At least, that was what the special grade curse saw in Naoya. Naoya was now between a rock and a hard place. Faced with this affront, he had to take Yuji and Choso's heads. And it was no longer something he had to do solely on the orders of the elders. Now it was a purely personal matter. He was on the same level as those two men. He couldn't be belittled like that. While those were Naoya Zenin's thoughts on Yuji Itadori, the older Choso brothers were different. After seeing his little brother's reaction to Naoya's attack, he understood what his brother was going through and what he had been carrying since his fight with Maldito. Yuji Itadori was growing, evolving like a curse would, and he was constantly growing under pressure and seemed to continue doing so. On the other hand, Yuji's own thoughts were focused solely on overcoming Naoya's curse technique and not letting him hit him again. In fact, he had made hitting Zenin his personal goal, not with residual strength, but with the full force of the divergent fist, in order to end the fight. Because of this, the battle had become a matter of whoever hits their target first, leaving everything else aside. If Yuji hit Naoya directly and with full force with a divergent fist, victory would go to Yuji himself. However, if Naoya used his own innate technique to its fullest and most efficient advantage, he could find a way to overcome Yuji's inhuman resistance. However, one element had to be added. Toso remained in the fight, being covered by Yuji. The two brothers complemented each other. Using the blood manipulation technique, Choso attacked from a distance, putting that distance between himself and Naoya, becoming a long-range fighter, while his younger brother Yuji fought directly and closely, like the close-range fighter he was. This shouldn't be a problem for Naoya, who was a first-grade sorcerer, being considered by himself as a special grade by putting himself on par with Satoru and Toji, the only ones he respected in that world. And the key was that it shouldn't be a problem, because the confrontation with Yuji had become complicated and was becoming more complicated as the seconds passed, although Naoya was not aware of it. In Choso's eyes, if he gave his brother enough time, he could defeat Naoya using the right weapons and creating the right scenario. But they had to hurry. Little brother, Choso's voice made Yuji glance at the curse. It creates a blood field. Hit it or let it hit you. I'll slow it down so you can beat it. A primitive plan, without too many complications. Understanding what Naoya's innate technique did, Choso had devised this plan in his own mind and planned to carry it out. If he stalled long enough, the divergent fist could finish off the sorcerer. Slowing his movements could lead to his defeat. The Tokyo student accepted his older brother's plan with a slight nod. It was the best course of action they had. I'll lure him to me and engage in a series of blows. I'll reserve cursed energy to converge with a divergent fist that will send him to his death. It was a simple plan that Yuji could easily follow and wouldn't have to overthink. It was, after all, the best way to get rid of the enemy and continue with the mission to rescue Professor Gojo from Kenjaku. What are you muttering about? Unaware of the brothers' plan, Naoya spoke with anger in his mouth. It's not like you can do anything. Your head is mine. 24 were the exact frames a minute was divided into for Naoya when he used the innate technique he inherited from his father. 24 were the exact frames Yuji counted when his perception of the surroundings improved thanks to whatever was happening to him. Knowing this, Yuji could generate a small battle plan in his mind to confront Naoya and obtain the time and blood that Choso needed. So when Naoya launched himself at Yuji, he waited for the exact moment, forcing the sorcerer to raise his arms and block the teenager's punch that sent him back to the starting point. Shit. He's reading my moves. Frustration was evident on his face, in the way he twisted his mouth or glared at Yuji as he repositioned himself for a second attempt. He had to find the weak spot in Sukuna's container and exploit it for his own victory and the recognition such an achievement deserved. Yuji, however, already knew Naoya's intentions. He had sensed it when he saw the way he looked at him, when he saw the way he repositioned himself. He made it abundantly clear that he was going after him, that he would throw himself at him, that he was the target. When Naoya disappeared from sight, Yuji simply waited. His body screamed at him to move, to evade. But he just stood there, waiting, counting down to the exact moment to act. If that confrontation had pitted Naoya against the Yuji before the Shibuya incident, Naoya's victory would have been assured. However, this Yuji Itadori was someone who was growing, constantly evolving after the confrontation with Maldito and adapting to his opponents, and Naoya was no exception to the rule. This valuable piece of information was only known to two people. Choso, who was preparing to act when his brother told him to, and Sukuna himself, who watched the confrontation with a frown and a question in his usually mocking and malicious gaze. As on previous occasions, Yuji struck Naoya's face, this time using his knee after pushing off with his leg to deliver the knee downwards and slam the sorcerer into the ground with a loud bang. NHG. The blow didn't come as a surprise, at least to Choso. Naoya's face, on the other hand, aside from being bloody, showed the irritation and confusion he felt. How was it possible that a rookie was surpassing him? How was it possible that he was beating him? Naoya's mind was in chaos, negative feelings swirling in his head. You're barking a lot, but you're biting little. Yuji allowed himself to show a slight mockery towards the downed Naoya, stinging the older sorcerer with his words. This, of course, only inflamed Naoya's temper and forced him to take Sukuna's vessel much more seriously than he was, deciding to face the boy on his own turf. hand-to-hand combat. When Naoya decided this, Choso understood something. His little brother was going to grow again during this fight. If his growth against Maldito was significant, against Naoya it would be absolutely gigantic, giving him the strength he would need later on. Naoya put aside his curse technique and entered Yuji's range. As an important member of the Zenin clan, Naoya knew how to fight hand-to-hand and knew moves that many people his age didn't. And as a first-grade sorcerer, he had the experience necessary to be able to face anyone below that rank. And Yuji was someone like that in his eyes. Naoya was leaving out some facts about Yuji. Surprising the Zenin, Yuji deflected the sorcerer's right arm and blocked his left by raising his forearm, palm facing inwards. Then, before Naoya could evade, Yuji hit the man with a two-section knee strike. A double knee strike consecutively in a split second, causing Naoya to spit blood and be thrown backwards. The fight with Maldito had not only taught Yuji how to handle the Black Flash, but it also adapted his body to an intense battle and to growth under the pressure of a battle in which his life depended on a thread, on a trivial error. He was no longer the Yuji Itadori who had first entered the Sorcerer Society. He was now a sorcerer who had survived death, the school exchange incident, the fight with the Choso brothers, and the Shibuya Incident, where he had directly fought Maldito and understood what his own body was like. In the eyes of Naoya and the elders, Yuji was merely Sukuna's vessel. In the eyes of people like Choso, Yuji Itadori was now a sorcerer whose growth was exponential and who could not be stopped unless he was killed. Yuji moved as Naoya tried to respond to Yuji's own movement. The two sorcerers collided forearms, generating a wave of wind that came from the clash of the two combatants' cursed energy. Within a second, the exchange of blows continued, with Naoya trying to find a way to land a blow and Yuji deflecting his enemy's movements. Right punch. Left jab. Hook. Back punch. Forearm deflection. Knee block. Naoya was surprised, but it wasn't something he'd acknowledge. Sukuna's container was reacting to his movements, to his blows. It was seeing what he was trying to do and blocking his movements or deflecting them as the occasion warranted, disarming his attack. Bucking bastard. She bit her tongue as Yuji deflected a blow from her and then slammed her chin up with his palm, causing her lower jaw to bite her tongue, causing blood to flood her mouth. NGH. When you put aside your curse technique, Yuji's shadow covered Naoya's body and his vision. You are nothing more than a simple puppet. Divergent fist. Yuji's right arm stretched out, wrapped in cursed energy, and connected directly with Naoya Zenin's body, who was embedded into the ground in a crushing blow that sent the sorcerer into a state of semi-consciousness. Thank you, Choso. Blood trickled down the curse's right side. Choso had created a deep cut on his body and used the blood to further slow Naoya down, something Naoya didn't notice due to his focus on Yuji and defeating him. The moment Choso accepted his brother's thanks, an enormous pressure made them both sweat. A dense and powerful cursed energy had entered and the pressure had multiplied almost threefold. So, Yuji Itadori. Taking a very similar position to the one Naoya Zenin had taken earlier, a dark-haired young man with a katana sheathed over his shoulder was watching Yuji and Choso with piercing black eyes. Bricka. Don't kill him. Yuji realized it too late. Two enormous hands grabbed his head and in a second, he found himself on his back, staring up at the sky. I have a goal to fulfill, the unsheathing of steel overshadowed the incessant rain. Please don't die. Chapter 3. There was a limited number for special grade sorcerers, something that was not equivalent for special grade curses, which were surpassed by those called kings, there being in the records of the Sorcery Society two current kings. The King of Curses Ryaman Sukuna and Rika Orimoto the Queen of Curses, two curses that, in the eyes of the sorcerers, exceeded the strength of the special grade. Special grade curses were highly potent and could be dealt with by either first grade or special grade sorcerers. However, the list of special grade sorcerers only included 4 individuals. Suguru Geto, Satoru Gojo, Yuki Tsukumo, and Yuta Okkotsu. The former was dead and his body controlled by Kenjaku, and the latter was in the confining prison. Facing Yuji Itadori and Choso stood one of the special grade sorcerers, Yuta Okkotsu, who maintained a serene gaze on the two, his dark eyes revealing nothing. In fact, his face didn't even seem to show anything, simply staring at them while Naoya crawled weakly. Both Yuji and Choso felt that Yuta was on another level far above them, and, in addition, he was accompanied by the Queen of Curses, who almost killed Yuji with a wave of her hands and had only knocked him down with her limbs, at the request of her wielder. But that wasn't what gave the sorcerer and the curse their idea. The cursed energy carried by the special grade sorcerer had been overwhelming to Yuji and Choso's senses, and they felt the pressure on their shoulders, as if 2 enormous slabs of cement had fallen on them, pushing them down with the pressure. By pure instinct, Choso had taken up his regular battle stance, preparing for the fight. But Yuji was a different case. That thing that had begun to bother him, that thing that had awakened after his confrontation with Maldito, was forcing him to look at Yuta and Rika with wolfish eyes, as if he were a predator incarnate in human flesh. And this feeling made Choso's skin prickle, Yuta raise an eyebrow, and Rika bare her teeth in a bloody smile, because unwittingly, Yuji had let his own intention slip even while lying on the ground, his eyes fixed on the dark sky. What's happening to me? The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, and yet not even Yuta, a special grade, or Choso, a special curse, could answer the teenager's question. They could only wait for him to stand up, for him to look at them with those predatory eyes. Maybe the young people or those who didn't feel it could not clarify the boy's doubt, but people like Satoru or Kenjaku could find the answer in a few seconds just by looking at Yuji. He was having an awakening and was growing by leaps and bounds at a dizzying speed. Awakening could be understood simply by a brief explanation. It occurred when sorcerers surpassed the threshold of what was possible under the most unlikely circumstances. And, from the Sorcerer Society's point of view, Yuji crossed that threshold by generating various black flashes in his confrontation with Maldito, growing, evolving, and sharpening his own energy, his own senses. Yuji crossed a boundary, passed a barrier even without having an inherent technique. If you ask the experts, Yuji was becoming too annoying and someone they'd have to get rid of if they didn't want to run into real trouble or a Sukuna with an overly strong container. I guess I can only follow this feeling that makes my veins boil. Yuji stood up unceremoniously. His pink hair fluttered slightly, but his eyes never glanced at Yuta or focused on Rika, who was circling Sukuna's young container like a predator. And to follow him, Yuta's eyes widened and Sukuna's smile only grew. I must keep fighting for my life. Survival. That was a good trigger for a sorcerer's evolution, for his growth. With the sealing of Satoru Gojo, survival had become the goal of the Curse King's vessel. To fight for his life. Under those circumstances, Yuji was going to grow while his intention was to save Satoru. The movement would have found its target if said target weren't a curse with much greater mobility than the boy. The arm swung and punched the air, generating a slingshot that made Yaya's hair, who was on the other end, flutter. Ah, that's some serious strength. The scrape of steel against leather brought Yuji's senses to Yaya's hand. He'd unsheathed his katana and imbued it with cursed energy. Rika, I'll take care of it. Stay out of it, okay? I have to have a talk with that Satoru guy. Yuta was direct and clear, so he didn't wait for an answer and launched himself at Yuji, moving his sword low along the ground, intending to cut him in two from below. Surprising Yaya, Yuji blocked the sword's movement and pushed it down with his leg wrapped in cursed energy, forcing the swordsman to tilt his body downwards, surprising him with said movement. Divergent fist. The arm moved with surprising speed. Yuta blocked the blow with his left forearm, but the second blow, coming from the lack of coordination between the cursed energy and Yuji's body, struck Yuta in the face and knocked him backward. Sin embargo, Ira Yuta Okkotsu. Despite the pain and the taste of blood, Yuta struck back with a downward elbow that made Yuji tremble at the force of his opponent to the point where his lower jaw was shaking from the pressure. Taking advantage of that second, the special grade sorcerer pushed Sukuna's container and took back his katana, separating himself from his opponent by a few meters. Yuta's dark eyes had become calculating. They scanned Yuji's body, examining it and determining that his opponent's body had some fighting experience and a strength far superior to that of a normal human, which surpassed all standards when he used cursed energy and became a greater danger. I have to maintain a good distance, calculate his tools, and fight under that premise constantly. As a reverse energy user, I can avoid accidental hits. I have to find a good opening to send him to the other side. Yuta took a deep breath and let his body relax completely, straining his ears. If he used his own curse technique, he could probably defeat Yuji in a single second. But he was curious to see how far he could go. Let's see what you can do, first year. Cursed energy was filling Yuta's body, overflowing. He was the boy Satoru saw as special and Kenjaku rejected. I'm coming for you now. He brought his sword down in a perfectly vertical slash until the tip of his katana touched the ground. A fissure formed in the ground, accompanied by a tremor, and a strong wind rushed toward his target, forcing him to cover himself with his arms. Exactly what I was looking for. Yuta ran at Yuji and turned the katana upside down, blunt side outward and cutting side inward, slashing down at his enemy, intending to cut him in two, or pretending to. Yuta really wanted to knock Yuji down and send him to dreamland. Yuji raised his forearm and deflected the katana, surprising Yuta again. The special grade sorcerer halted his movement and spun around, dragging his sword. If he couldn't handle the blunt end, he would handle the sharp end, and he brought a spinning slash down on the 15-year-old's back. Anticipating this, Yuji blocked the sword with his fist wrapped in cursed energy, forcing Yuta to exert pressure to see who would dominate this confrontation between cursed energies. This guy is interesting. Well, you're a mere toy, Yuji, he's a self-made man. Do you really expect to beat someone like that? A small explosion forced the two sorcerers to separate, leaving them 10 meters apart. Their energy caused the explosion as they faced each other, fading when neither seemed willing to give in and leave their summoner without weapons. Probably, if Yuji had asked him to, Choso would have fought alongside him. But, just as Rika stayed away, Choso chose not to intervene in his little brother's fight, understanding that he was seeking this confrontation for some inexplicable reason. After all, he would intervene if Yuji suffered serious injuries. The advantage was on Yuta's side, and strangely, Yuji knew he couldn't beat him. Not at least in his current state, with his experience at that moment. His body, which was no stranger to what was happening, was asking him to stop going, yet he couldn't slow down now. It was as if a car had had its brakes removed and been left rolling down a hill. Death was all Yuji saw. Everything slowed down. The pounding of his heart filled Yuji's ears. The sound of saliva passing through his throat was louder than his breathing itself. Both Yuji and Yuta kept their distance. Cursed energy enveloped the former's fists, while the latter held the katana ready, with cursed energy surrounding the blade at all times, without any interruption in the constant flow the sorcerer maintained. The crunch was the cause of the exchange of blows. Showcasing moves similar to those he used against Mahito in his final phase, Yuji deflected the blade with his hands like a true martial artist. He didn't seek to strike Yuta or break through his defense. He simply sought to remain intact against his enemy's slashes, waiting for the exact moment for a blow that would end the confrontation. A blow that didn't seem to come, one that Yuta didn't seem to allow, nor was he going to allow. Surprising Yuji, Yuta hit the young sorcerer with his shoulder, causing him to stumble back slightly. That was enough for the swordsman to attempt to stab his opponent, only to be surprised when Yuji's hands wrapped around the katana's blade without any protection. I can't afford to lose. I can't allow myself to be defeated right now. Both of them were falling toward the ground. If Yuji fell, Yuta could pass through him with the inertia of the movement. Gojo-sensei needs me. Get out of the way. Yuji quickly placed his right hand on the ground. At the same time, the young man wrapped his legs around the swordsman's waist and, without thinking, with a swift and powerful spin, slammed Yuta into the concrete, generating a rather annoying sound that created the image of the swordsman's open head and the two curses that were watching. That hurt, Yuta grunted, standing up. Blood trickled from his right temple. His once white shirt was now splattered with red. But it's nothing I can't handle, Yuji Itadori. The first-year sorcerer's eyes widened. He'd underestimated Yuta Okkotsu, who was standing before him 1 second and black the next. I suppose you're going to try to attack me, aren't you? Yuta's dark eyes shifted to Choso, who stopped. You shouldn't do that, if you want to live. Chapter 4. 4 people were hiding in an abandoned area of the desolate Shibuya district, around what appeared to be a small campfire in the middle of the 4. One of them was lying down, his eyes closed, but he was breathing, as evidenced by the slight rise and fall of his chest, indicating to the other 3 that he was either asleep or unconscious, the latter being the case for the teenager. After the short confrontation between Sukuna's container and Rika's carrier, Yuta had a brief conversation with the sorcerer sent by the elders, validating the death of Yuji Itadori and the special grade curse that accompanied him, which was knocked down with a single blow from Yuta. Naoya was, above all, a distrustful person. He trusted only strong people, those like him who had left their mark on sorcerer society, leading him to believe he was on the same level as the 2 monsters of his generation. Satoru Gojo and Toji Fushiguro. However, a monster from the next generation had caused Naoya to reconsider whether he could stay alive if he tried to take the heads of Choso and Yuji, both unconscious at Yuta Okkotsu's feet. However, the difference between the 2 sorcerers was clear. Naoya didn't need much scrutiny to understand that if he fought Yuta, he would be eliminated in seconds. Something that would embarrass him even more, as he had already been defeated by Choso and Yuji together, using trashy techniques. Wanting to hide this, Naoya could only accept Yuta's proposal. It was the best thing for him. If Yuji was dead, what difference did it make to hide the incident from the rest of us? He went after Fushiguro and Yuji. Letting Yuta take the body wasn't something he was too worried about, though he should have. Sitting in front of Yuta was the special grade curse known as Choso, who was also a cursed womb created by Kenjaku. At the start, Yuji, who had been lying on the ground completely unconscious, sat up on a sheet, looking into the darkness and feeling the presence of people behind him. Little brother. Toso spoke calmly, as if to comfort Yuji. Toso? The sorcerer's calm gaze turned troubled at Yuta's presence. You should take it easy. Facing Okkotsu must have left you in a very bad state internally. Yuji's eyes widened. Standing in front of Choso and Yuta was his best friend, his teammate at the Tokyo school. Megumi Fushiguro, who was showing some minor injuries from his confrontation with one of his summons, and a sorcerer allied with Geto, who turned out to be Kenjaku. Megumi. Yuji's eyes glittered, boring into Megumi like two thrown knives, causing a drop of sweat to trickle down the shadow sorcerer's chin. "You don't have to look at me like that," the boy murmured, sipping his coffee. "We have a lot to talk about, discuss, and plan. With Gojo-sensei's confinement and Kenjaku's victory, things have gotten complicated for us, the renegades of the Sorcerer Society." The elders had made a decision. They blamed Director Yaga for the Shibuya incident, arguing that Geto was still alive and that they had let him go. This, of course, prompted the higher-ups to keep Satoru under their seal and kill Yaga, who left this world, making Director Gakuganji realize his own mistakes and the current problems within Sorcerer Society. "Gojo-sensei made me come back if certain things were met to take care of his students." Megumi and Yuji looked at each other briefly and looked back at Yuta. "Of course, after what Gojo-sensei did for me, I'm not going to deny anything to the man who rescued me from hell." Yuta Okkotsu, during his first year in Tokyo, went through the same situation as Yuji. He was brought to a point where his life depended on his actions and the protection of Satoru, who protected the boy and helped him free Rika from her curse, something for which he would always be grateful. He was also the one who sent him to train abroad under Miguel's supervision. But to free the sensei, we should know how to do it, right? Kenjaku didn't seem too willing to let go of the only man who scared him. Megumi looked at Yuji and frowned. There was something different about his companion. The voice, the pose, and the brightness of his eyes seemed just right, but his senses were telling the young sorcerer that his companion had changed for some reason, though Megumi couldn't say what exactly, only that something was different. "There's a man who can give us a solution, or who probably knows it. Tenjin-sama is the only one who might see a way to rescue Professor Satoru and give us a chance to stop Kenjaku before he begins his plan." The four boys' goal was the same. To free Satoru so he could fight Kenjaku. Their problem? Choso was working with a group because his brother was with them. The second problem was the information they had or the plans Kenjaku was putting forward after obtaining the strongest sorcerer. Of course, if Kenjaku's goal was to keep Satoru locked up, the goal of the strongest sorcerer's students was to free him from the confining prison so the two sorcerers could face each other. But it wasn't going to be an easy task, something even Yuji could sense from Megumi's furrowed brow and Yuta's lost but serious gaze. The hope then lies in contacting Tenjin and learning about Kenjaku's current situation and plans. We also need information from him. Kenjaku was an enigma to sorcerers and society as a whole. Apparently, according to the Talking Brain's own words, he had spent a century switching bodies, possessing sorcerers with different techniques he needed, mistaking Suguru Geto for the innate technique he possessed. If that Tenjin has the necessary information, Yuji clapped his palms together, then we'll talk to him. He'll surely help us, despite our situation. There was determination in those words, one Yuji hadn't shown before. He had been introduced to the Sorcerer Society only 2 or 3 months ago and was taken to a place where they wanted to kill him, where they wanted to eliminate him and take his very life. Of course, Satoru had protected him in front of the elders and devised a plan to protect him and keep him alive as long as possible. And he agreed. He agreed because it was the only way to protect the people. The same people who had died at his hands in Shibuya when Sukuna had taken his body. And more people will die if you don't know how to do things, boy. But despite the circumstances, there was a plan they could follow. They had a plan of action and potential allies to count on to free Professor Gojo. Of course, Yuji was determined to go see Tenjin and get all the information from him, as well as Kenjaku's objective, and be able to arrest him for everything he had done, for everything he was doing. "The hard part will be finding Tenjin," Yuta spoke up, his eyes fixed on the campfire. The glow of the fire could be seen in the teenager's gaze, even allowing anyone to see the dance of the flames in those dark pits. "He's inside that labyrinth at the Tokyo school. We're not exactly the ideal people to navigate there, Yuji." In the eyes of the elders, Yuji Itadori had been killed by Yuta Okkotsu, according to Naoya Zenin's own words. Zenin had kept his promise to the second-year sorcerer, knowing that he could kill him if he used his curse or his power. Naoya had sensed the density and strength of Yuta's cursed energy. It was, if anything, much denser than Satoru's, much heavier. And the Zenin heir wasn't going to anger a sorcerer with that kind of power at his disposal, without really knowing if he could defeat him with any moves at his disposal. But that didn't stop the elders from sending someone stronger behind them to assassinate Yuji and Yuta himself, the latter for treason. Even Megumi was on the elders' list of renegades, and it didn't look like he would be removed anytime soon. "It doesn't matter," Yuji's voice sounded slightly hoarse, as if he had gone too long without a drink or a break for his vocal cords. "We can do this. I know it might be totally risky, but if we don't do it, Gojo-sensei will stay in that cube that locked him up and we don't know when he'll come out again. Gojo would be held in the confinement prison until Kenjaku wanted to, or someone found a way to free him. Since such a tool existed, the young sorcerers knew there must be a key, a way to free the master and return the world to how it was before the incident. And to do so, they would have to take a risk and go see Tenjin, the only one who could help them now, since to the rest, they were just renegades of society, terrorists who caused all the chaos in Shibuya, all the death. Are you going to move toward the school? Knowing that veteran wizards will be after you? Yuji and Megumi stared at each other for a few moments. Megumi's words held true. He would be hunted like a mere wild animal and held captive for the hundreds of deaths he caused when he allowed Sukuna to escape for a time. That doesn't matter now, the decision emerged from deep within Yuji. Tenjin can help us save Gojo-sensei, and that's what we're going to do. Would that be a problem, Megumi? Megumi Fushiguro was so tempted to answer his partner's question and back down. But the boy's intense eyes stared at him, shining with a determination he'd never seen before and precisely what he lacked. The determination to fight, to give his all in a fight to the bitter end. And Yuji had always given his all. No, Yuji, he felt his lips move into a thin smile too small for anyone to see. Let's go get Tenjin-sama then and we'll organize from there. I know the perfect spot, the pink-haired boy admitted, fist bumping. From that room, we can fight Kenjaku. Chapter 5. Kenjaku's plan was to initiate the sacrifice game with the intention of eliminating all those who were inferior, eradicating all those who lacked cursed energy and were simply empty shells of no interest. He was trying to create evolution and have humans fuse with Tenjin in order to change the entire world as a whole. That was Kenjaku's goal, according to Tenjin, and it's told very superficially. No one could figure out exactly what Kenjaku was thinking or what he was doing to fully carry it out, but as sorcerers, they had established a route with various plans and minor objectives in order to defeat Kenjaku and any allies he had. The first objective the boys set was to seize the Zenin clan's curse tools as insurance for a war against Kenjaku and his allies or any curse under their command. This mission would be led by Maki Zenin and supported by Megumi, who had been made leader after the death of the previous clan leader and the breaking of the will. The second objective was to find allies to rely on in order to accomplish the following objectives, which involved trying to recruit some stray, expelled, or non-elder sorcerers who were partially loyal to Satoru when he was still free, giving them a minimal chance, given the few students the strongest sorcerer worked with. The third objective was to obtain the necessary points to change some rules of the sacrifice game and be able to remove Megumi's sister, Tsumiki, who had been included in the game after having awakened from her coma induced by a curse that struck her a year ago. The fourth objective was to find Angel, the only sorcerer capable of breaking the prison where Professor Satoru was sealed and thus being able to make the man join the battle, being the best chance for them to defeat someone like Kenjaku. With those goals accomplished, the rogue sorcerers were ready to stop the sacrificial game and defeat Kenjaku once and for all, removing him from the plane of the living and sending him to the other side, where he should have been for several hundred years. And you really think you can do it? I remind you that most of the sorcerers loyal to that man were harmed because of you, without any consideration. Sukuna's cruel laughter echoed in Yuji's head. The boy sat on the steps, staring at his hands, feeling a mouth appear on the left side of his face and begin to smile cruelly, his skin moving. Ah. Are you going to answer me with silence? I thought we were starting to get along after all those deaths, Sukuna laughed amusedly, full of malice, enjoying the tension he exerted on the teenager who was his container. Do I need to remind you that Inumaki and Todo were hurt because of you? If you had been able to stop Maldito, I highly doubt that muscle jerk would have lost his ritual or been hurt. And if that brother of yours hadn't defeated you, I probably wouldn't have killed those girls and caused all the destruction in Shibuya. You're just as guilty as. Yuji hit his own cheek with his left fist, causing a slight pain to run through his face and the hit area to turn slightly reddish due to the direct blow. But it worked and the taste of blood inside his mouth didn't bother him too much. Sukuna proceeded to remain silent and the boy was able to stare into nothingness again, as if there was nothing in front of him or couldn't see what was actually a few meters away from him. Unlike the people who were supposed to help him, Yuji had only been acting as a sorcerer for 3 months. In that time, he saw Junpei die and had to kill other modified humans. He died by his own hand but was revived by the pact with Sukuna. He saw Nanami die without really being able to do anything. He caused the destruction of Shibuya and killed, probably quite a few, more than 200 people, including some sorcerers and the workers who work with them. He was unable to prevent Satoru from being sealed. He caused Todo to lose his arm and his technique. He caused Inumaki to be severely injured and lose his left arm. I love it so much when you wallow in your own misery, kid. It's fun for a dark soul like mine. Will you ever be happy? Because I'm going to make your life a living hell. Itadori. The pink one raised his head slightly, showing the scar that crossed his face to his second-year classmate Maki Zenin, a curse tools user who, due to the heavenly curse, had obtained a physical power that increased over time and that seemed to propel her as some kind of short-range fighter with capabilities far superior, physically speaking, to many of her classmates. Maki-san. The voice came out as a small whisper that could have been lost in the wind, fading as if it had never existed. And that caught the attention of one of the few women in that hidden room, who looked at the boy with some pity. I think the scar on your face gives you a tough guy vibe. Don't tell Yuta I told you, though. Maki forced a thin smile even though the scars tugged at her skin and she was forced to press her lips together slightly. Jogo's fire had caused those horrible scars, but they were a reminder of what she'd learned from leaving Shibuya alive, those marks the only sign that she could survive long, hard battles, contrary to what her relatives thought. Thank you. The scars were Yuji's reminder of his fight with Maldito, of the point he reached in the confrontation with the humanoid curse, and everything it had cost him. What were you thinking about? The girl sat down next to the boy and looked in the same direction he was. I saw you lost in your thoughts. He hadn't told anyone what was constantly on his mind or how he felt about the deaths on his shoulders. He was hurt emotionally and tired. He couldn't stop Maldito in time, and he couldn't stop Sukuna or intercede for Satoru. I guess about everything in Shibuya. The girl understood with that slow, halting sentence. Yuji was overstepping his bounds, mentally wounding himself over the deaths that weren't his fault. She had been raised as a Zenin and knew the risks of being a sorceress. But Yuji wasn't a member of a clan and wasn't accustomed to the life they led, nor to that intense battle they'd had in Shibuya, from which they survived by pure miracle and the appearance of a special grade. Everyone in this room shares the blame, Itadori. No one could stop Kenjaku or help Professor Satoru. Him being locked up doesn't benefit us. It harms us greatly and it's something we need to fix. I guess, after Yuki and Choso, he's the only adult we need, huh? Yuji's eyes moved among the group. They were 4 students, ranging in age from 15 to 17. Of the group that was becoming rebels, only Yuki and Choso were adults, but they would stay behind to look after Mr. Tenjin, and as students, they would each go their separate ways, separating themselves from the group. But Gojo-sensei, we can stop this. Maki glanced briefly at her partner's hands. They were trembling imperceptibly. Yuji probably wasn't noticing, or at least didn't seem to give any indication that he was aware of the slight tremor in his hands. Nanami, Nobara, Gojo, Junpei, Shibuya. The girl listed every single case the boy had been involved in less than 3 months. Each one had been a critical blow to his mentality and sanity, to his strength in the face of any problem. That strength was cracked like glass and could shatter at any moment, even if he was able to fight people like Yuta or Naoya. That's for sure, he said, looking ahead again. It was better to give him some encouragement than to allow him to panic. They had to follow the objectives they discussed with Tenjin. You're going with Megumi to find Kinji and the rest of the third-year students, right? Just. Although it may not seem like it, Kinji Hakari is a clever mind in his own right. He can read situations better than some people think, considering his poor performance in school. Maki had met Kinji several times during their first year when the boy was a sophomore. He was perceptive, mentally agile, and although he wasn't a star student, Kinji could always turn situations around. Be careful with his words. He can read the situation in a moment and things can get complicated. You mean we'll have to fight? With our own senpai? Kinji and the other third years aren't our senpai, Itadori. They're going to do whatever they want, however they want, whenever they want. If you can get them to help us with this incident, you'll probably be appreciated by them in some way. A sigh escaped his lips. But again, it's a very unlikely possibility. However, we can't go to Kyoto for reinforcements. Yuji nodded at Maki's words and proceeded to store all of Kinji Hakari's information in his mind, recording it so he could use it at any time during the meeting with the third-year student. I'll keep that in mind when I go to the meeting with Kinji Hakari, Maki-san. She nodded and stood up. She briefly glanced at her fellow first-year's hands. They were no longer trembling, at least visibly to her. He seemed back to normal, his mind focused. Could that be what Itadori needed? Focus. She registered it in her own mind and decided to save it for later. It's time for me to go, he said, giving Itadori one last look before smiling a little. Keep that mind focused, Itadori. You'll see, everything will be okay. Chapter 6. The rules in Sorcerer Society are inflexible for most people. Those like Satoru Gojo could get away with anything because of the power they held, both politically and physically, accomplishing some things that other sorcerers couldn't do, no matter how hard they tried, due to the rules established when the Sorcerer Society itself was created a few hundred years ago, the same rules that people like Satoru Gojo wanted to change completely. The reason Yuta Okkotsu and Yuji Itadori remained alive after being determined to be dangerous was thanks to Satoru's influence, much to the displeasure of the elders. The albino-haired sorcerer possessed a power that made him the balance between sorcerers and curses. And thanks to being that balance, he was able to do things other sorcerers couldn't. Because of this, Kinji Hakari and his third-year classmates from Tokyo were suspended from school after a certain incident, leaving Kinji free to run a place with underground fights, focused on showing the powers of some sorcerers to non-sorcerers, something that was against the rules, but that no one had tried to stop, and that now no one seemed to pay attention to because of the problems Kenjaku had caused. An underground fighting venue generated money, and even more so when wizards entered the fight, and many people couldn't understand what was going on. Kinji's eyes never left Panda, his second-year classmate, and Yuji Itadori, the boy who had entered today's fight. And he had to admit that Yuji was fighting hand-to-hand with Panda, which made him slightly suspicious. People who couldn't manipulate cursed energy didn't have the same strength as those who could, unless of course, they had been marked by a heavenly mark that removed the cursed energy and granted them unmatched physical power. That boy is hitting Panda. The feminine-looking boy sat to Kinji's right, watching the fight between Panda and Yuji with him. The boy had shoulder-length dark hair, with a light-colored lock over his right eye. His clothing, as well as his thin body, made the boy look more like a girl than a boy, which could be confusing to people. I can deduce, Kinji clasped his hands under his chin, his eyes never leaving Yuji's movements, that boy is a sorcerer. No one could deal with Panda if they were a normal person or an average teenager. Even martial arts experts would have trouble with him. And this boy, he's one. The image on the screen was of Yuji standing over a downed Panda, his arm raised by the referee. But Kinji felt something strange about it. The teenager's eyes were looking toward the camera, as if he knew where they were, as if he could locate them despite being a considerable distance away, several floors above the boy. Shall I call him? Yes, Kurara. I want to meet our new champion. He leaned back on the couch, arms draped over the backrest, calmly staring up at the ceiling. If he's beaten Panda, he could be a very interesting tool for our games, don't you think? Kurara Hashi nodded at Kinji's words, bringing a phone to her left ear. Yes. I want you to bring Yuji to our base. Kinji wants to meet him. He hung up a moment later, giving a slight bow to Kinji and leaving the room to greet Yuji Itadori on the rooftop, the place where they had positioned themselves to pull the strings on all of this, the same place few of the guests or fighters would ever find on their own. To get there, they would have to get past the guards posted there, and that would give them the warning they needed to move at just the right moment. No matter what, no one could reach them and harm them or obtain anything. Kurara's eyes shifted as the door leading to the rooftop opened. Walking toward them was Yuji Itadori, a scar running across his face, likely from some fight he'd had before arriving with them. But that already lit a flame of suspicion in her head, as did the way he walked and looked around, as if searching for any possible attack against him or any attempt at aggression. The boy was alert, and Kurara admired that, but it also worried her slightly, not understanding how someone so young could be so prepared for a confrontation. I guess you are, Hakari. There was doubt in Yuji's voice. The person standing before him wasn't a man. With a distinctly feminine appearance, he didn't fit the description Yuta and Maki had given him of the third-year student. He was the complete opposite of what his classmates had mentioned. No, Kurara placed a hand on her hip, striking a feminine pose. Hakari is inside. She pointed with her thumb toward the only place where the person who had called him to the place and from where Kurara had come could be. Yuji Itadori is waiting for you. I'm going to check on some things. Yuji nodded and walked past Kurara without looking back, but the boy looked at the first-year student's right fist. It was closed, tight, and compact, as if ready to strike at any moment. This kid is going to be a problem. Kurara's deduction wasn't entirely wrong, but she still let the boy in to see Kinji. If things got ugly, Kinji could probably get rid of Yuji with a few moves. But something was drawing her attention intensely. Something was worrying her. With every step Yuji took toward the booth, Kurara swore she saw a misty shape behind him, like an enormous specter generated by his cursed energy, giving her a cold feeling that kept her in place for the next few seconds. Is that normal? Kinji's eyes darted around, and a mocking smile appeared on his face as they rested on the first year's own eyes. Yuji stood with a low table between him and Kinji, staring at the third year unfazed. So you'll say? Yuji stared at Kinji Hakari, his face blank, his eyes boring into the third-year students for a few seconds. Maki's words about his classmate came to mind, everything he'd been hiding inside his mind. He was walking on very fragile ice. One false step and he'd sink with it. I've been looking for you, Yuji spoke slowly, assessing the boy's face. We need you. Why would that be, kid? Kinji leaned forward and rested his hands on his thighs, staring at Yuji's face, looking for any hint that he could jump him. I don't think we've ever met. Yuji Itadori, he reached across the table, surprising Kinji. I'm a first-year student at the Tokyo School of Jujutsu. The older boy's eyes widened, and the smirk turned into a thin, hard line that spread across his face. Ah, I see. What exactly is a first year doing with a third year like me? You should know I was dismissed from school, and this is like a manhunt. What few knew about the elders, and something that had been constantly hidden, was that they persecuted those who strayed from sorcery until they were eliminated. People like him, Kinji Hakari, were to be erased for breaking the Sorcerer Society's dogmas, going against all the rules and everything established by them in a bygone era. I'm not interested. Satoru Gojo was sealed away, Kinji's eyes widened again. And we need all the help we can get to rescue him. We need you. Kinji remained silent for the next few seconds, ignoring his phone as it began to ring. He'd known Yuji was hiding something inside his head and from them when he defeated Panda. He'd associated him with the school of sorcerers and knew he was connected to them. But why had he been so direct as to not hide anything from him and just go straight to the point? That was something he hadn't anticipated, and it both bothered and pleased him. The loud bang stopped Kinji's thoughts. He turned his head and saw Kurara's number flashing on the screen, along with a message about Yuji. It seemed the boy was being supported by Panda and another first year, Megumi Fushiguro. So you come here and… The cracking sound halted any further words. Kinji leaped upward, dodging a direct blow from Yuji that shattered the table, sending a shower of wooden splinters obscuring his vision. This gave the first year the opportunity to grab him by the jacket, throwing Kinji hard against the door, knocking it down, and sending the third year skidding across the floor. You. Ah, Kurara. Kinji raised his hand and stopped his companion with a gesture. Never mind. Can you handle Panda and that dead-eyed brunette? The smile on the third-year student's lips made Kurara hesitate. I think I've found something interesting. Step by step, Yuji Itadori stepped out from the spot Kinji had previously occupied, revealing eyes obscured by his hair, glowing yellow like a predator's. Or could that be the imagination of everyone staring at Yuji at that very moment, like Naoya's? If you want to convince me, you're going to have to fight, kid. You're going to have to fight and make me think that my help can actually be beneficial for both of us. And I hope you're ready for some broken bones. Chapter 7. Two figures moved across the rooftop while the other three watched, not intervening in the confrontation. The first one ducked his body and like a boxer tried to connect a direct jab against the side of his opponent, something that the latter anticipated and blocked by moving his leg and using it as a defense, causing his foot to stop his enemy's punch and propelling him into a jump, ending up 10 meters away from his enemy, slightly crouched. But the second figure was falling on the first one with a devastating divergent punch that sent a jolt through the building, with a second wave that made his opponent stumble, forcing him to steady himself on the ground by sending the force from his waist to his legs. For Yuji Itadori, Kinji Hakari had above-average physical power and could withstand his blows or fierce movements without ruffling a single strand of his slicked-back hair. He also didn't seem to be a sorcerer who would tire quickly, and the experience the boy had on him implied a total of 2 years of work on top of the 3 months he had been a sorcerer, with a basic understanding and simple use of cursed energy and any other tool. For Kinji Hakari, that had gone from being an ordinary day to something somewhat entertaining, showing some interest in Yuji Itadori and his intention to recruit him to rescue Satoru Gojo from the prison where he had been held. But it was not something he was going to do openly without getting something in return and without verifying that they could really obtain Satoru's prison from the hands of his enemy. Aligning himself with a weak formation would only lead to his death, and his mind was not interested in leading him and Kurara to their deaths, which he discarded as soon as it appeared in his head, even for a second. The two young men stared at each other for a few seconds. Yuji still had his fist embedded in the ground, cracks emerging from the epicenter of the impact, his limb having not felt any damage from the blow. Kinji remained distant, observing any reaction the first year might have. Slowly, a yellowish leaf fell between the two students. That seemed to be the signal. Kinji and Yuji moved forward and began exchanging blows with each other, recreating a perfect image that could have been made into a martial arts comic. However, Kinji's superiority began to gap between the two, increasing the distance and the difference when the third-year boy punched Yuji in the face and knocked him down with a sweep that sent the pink-haired boy onto his back. When the older boy went to slam his knee into his opponent's chest, the latter placed his hands and did a circus somersault to evade it. He's put 2 years of work and training into my time as a sorcerer. And I don't have the martial arts skills to make a difference. My body doesn't respond quickly enough to his movements, and the pressure he puts on me in that area forces me to falter. And he has the strength to back that up. However, in that regard, I win. For every blow I land, that's 5 of his on my body. Yuji Itadori watched Kinji Hakari's stance as he tried to find a weakness in his defense or a way around what the older boy knew. Satoru had taken it upon himself to train him to control cursed energy and Todo had trained him slightly to improve his divergent fist, but that didn't make a complete discipline to handle someone when he didn't want to kill them. Or did it? It was possible that Kinji wanted to kill him, but Yuji wasn't trying to kill his potential backup, and all he had was brute strength over anything else Kinji had besides his divergent fist. The situation was balanced towards Kinji Hakari. The third year seemed to notice, seeing the doubt in the rookie's brown eyes, and that was all it took to propel himself forward, surprising Yuji. Taking advantage of the boy's hesitation, the third year wrapped himself around him in a jujutsu move that knocked the pink-haired boy to the ground, his arm restrained by Kinji's arms, while his legs pinned him to the ground with superhuman strength. "I'm going to break this arm, Yuji Itadori." The threat wasn't a threat as such. Kinji Hakari was going to break his arm if he didn't do something about it, and he could feel it as the older boy pulled at his limb and shoved it down with his sorcerer's strength, fueled by cursed energy. But if Kinji could play that game, he could play it better. He breathed and calmed his mind. He relaxed his body and let the cursed energy move toward his restrained arm, hardening it. When it did, Yuji shifted and stood up, his arm still on the ground, held in Kinji's strength by the arm lock. Rah! Kinji's eyes widened as he felt the ground disappear, and he was held in the air by the force of Yuji Itadori's limb. Though it didn't take long for the lack of ground to be refilled. The first year brought his arm down hard and slammed the third year hard into the ground, cracking it and causing pain to shoot down Kinji's back. Kinji spat out some blood as he loosened his tight grip on Yuji's limb, leaving him free to walk several steps back. He just used brute force. Kurara watched the blow with wide eyes, distracted from her own fight against Megumi and Panda. Despite her excessive trust in Kinji, he hadn't expected a first year to be able to accomplish that with only the strength of his own arm and no technique. He certainly didn't expect him to slam his teammate into the ground with a one-handed bomb, pushing the force forward with cursed energy. It was, certainly, surprising. Something has changed in Itadori-kun. Panda blinked as he watched the confrontation. He knew Yuji and his abilities, but he hadn't expected this to happen without the help of his divergent fister Sukuna. While Yuji was able to defeat Maldito, it was only with the help of Aoi Todo, and even the pink-haired boy didn't have the strength to defeat someone with experience. Megumi responded with silence, but she didn't disagree with Panda's words. After the Shibuya incident, Yuji Itadori had undergone some kind of transformation, and he seemed to have become a better sorcerer, though she couldn't determine what had changed. Was it the trauma of the incident? Or the deaths of his classmates? Megumi couldn't answer the questions and could only watch as everything unfolded as Yuji grew or died trying. Arg. That was good. Kinji slowly began to stand up, showing an amused smile, slightly stained by the blood from his spit. "I didn't see that coming, you little first-year brat. This is actually fun." Kinji lunged forward again, mimicking his moves from the previous time. He was going to trap Yuji in a worse Jujutsu hold and break his body to get what he wanted. But that was Kinji Hakari's mistake. Yuji caught the movement, read it, registered it in his mind, and reacted by inertia, moving against Kinji's movement, appearing in front of the third year and slamming his knee into his face, breaking his nose and sending him stumbling backward, blood trickling down his chin. Buck. Yuji raised his arms, slightly bent his legs, and covered any gaps he might have, while placing his left leg in front of his right. His hair stirred, and the wind lightly caressed his face. But even that didn't make him blink or flinch from Kinji's eyes. "That was fun," I admitted. He wiped the blood dripping from his mangled nose. He waved his hand and smiled, looking at Yuji Itadori a few feet away. "But we can do this much better. Why don't you show me your curse technique? I want to see everything you have up your sleeve." "I don't have a curse technique," the teenager acknowledged, not letting his guard down. "I don't have anything like that to back up what I do. Just my control of cursed energy and my own brute strength." Surprised by that, Kinji Hakari. Kinji blinked several times, incredulous at the first year's response. Seconds later, a genuine laugh escaped his mouth, echoing across the rooftop. "Ha ha ha ha. Oh my god. This is so funny, Yuji Itadori." The laughter slowly faded, but Kinji's grinning lips closed, only diminishing in size and intensity. "I can't imagine someone without a curse technique working with those old people, if you ask me. But I guess you can be someone special. They wanted to execute me. That. Satoru Gojo-sensei managed to avoid my death, I don't know how. I suppose it was through his position that he gave me this life now, a life that has been marred by Kenjaku and his schemes, and by my teacher being imprisoned in a prison." The boy's eyes turned hard and cold. Kinji felt as if a metal blade was caressing his chin and, out of inertia, he stroked it to see if he was bleeding or if a blade was really caressing him. "And I'm going to do this, with or without your help, Kinji Hakari." The pink-haired boy's words echoed across the rooftop, reaching the ears of Kurara, Panda, and Megumi, as well as Kinji's own. They even sounded resolute, befitting a person who had nothing left to lose and who could keep going despite what was happening. It was surprising to see how determined Yuji Itadori was to finish off Kenjaku and rescue Professor Satoru Gojo from the prison where his enemies had him imprisoned. I understand, Kinji's shoulders dropped slightly, and the intent disappeared from his posture, looking at the first-year boy with a certain respect. I suppose if we keep fighting, you'll eventually kill me. What? Calm down, Kurara. Kinji raised a hand, stopping his companion. I'm looking into Yuji Itadori's eyes, and I see resolve in them. We're not going to achieve anything by keeping them here, only wasting their time. If we keep fighting, eventually the boy will overwhelm me and end up defeating me if I don't use my domain. And I even think his stamina would overcome my mental stamina. Someone who's suffered and endured like he has would beat me in a battle of psychological stamina. I'm not very smart, but even I'm seeing that. The group of traitorous sorcerers and members of the resistance against Kenjaku blinked to Kinji Hakari's words, looking surprised. Was he giving in when they hadn't even given him anything to join them? So, are you joining us, Hakari? What do I gain? I can fight on Itadori's side because I respect him. But I'm not going to risk myself completely for nothing, Fushiguro. I'm the leader of the Zenin clan. We can come to some sort of agreement for your help. The fox-like grin appeared on Kinji Hakari's face. I think we're going to get along, Megumi Fushiguro. Megumi wasn't interested in being the leader of the Zenin clan, and he wasn't interested in leading them to glory with that crusade. He had a certain fondness for the man who had looked after him as a father figure, and Megumi wasn't going to let him rot in Kenjaku's hands. Of course, he was going to give everything he could to get Satoru Gojo back. Just write me a check and I'll sign it, the dark-haired man agreed, looking relaxed. As long as you help us in the sacrifice game. Ha! At least my death will be filled with a little money and glory, right? Chapter 8. Sweat slowly trickled down Yuji Itadori's face, soaking the neck, part of his chest, and back of the black sleeveless t-shirt he was currently wearing. His arms were burning hot, and his legs didn't seem to want to respond to his mind's commands to return to hitting the punching bag that was hanging a few meters away from him, right in front of him, at the distance of his fully extended leg when he threw a kick. He had been training for a few hours to eliminate the tension he felt in his body, which, combined with the worry and regrets enveloping his mind, was keeping him from sleeping or resting for the next day. In a few hours, they would plan their strategy to move accordingly. Kinji had joined the group, and they could work to find the people they needed to swell their group against Kenjaku's, who was likely expanding his ranks with any ally or sorcerer he found interesting or with greater power. The group of students, Yuji, Megumi, Panda, Kinji and Kurara, had returned to the hidden room inside the Tokyo school, and where the students were resting for the next move they had on their list, although there were two of them at the moment, and they had to see how to proceed with both. Megumi's mind was solely focused on her sister and getting the girl out of the sacrifice game so she could live a peaceful life. But there was also the fact that they had to follow Angel and obtain her in order to free Satoru from the confining prison and be able to make the professor stop Kenjaku and his allies. Those were the two moves the group had on the table. Megumi had positioned himself on the path to scoring points to eliminate his sister from the game, which made sense to the rest of the students in the room. If any of them had a family member, they would do the same as Megumi. And Yuji would go with him. But Kinji appeared walking with his hands in his pockets. Panda, Megumi and Kurara who were sitting looked at the third-year boy sit in front of them, and Yuji turned his head over his shoulder to look at his classmates, while he let his arms drop and a sigh came out of his mouth. Our plans should be as follows. From the information we have obtained, we currently have two possible targets to change the rules. Hiromi Higuruma located in Colony No. 1 of Tokyo and Hajime Kashimo located in Colony No. 2 of Tokyo. Both have 100 points to be able to change the rules in our favor or to complete one of the objectives. The third-year student's eyes moved to Megumi Fushiguro, the only member of that room who was worried about a familiar, given that he had been directly affected by the sacrifice game that Kenjaku put upon the world. We should figure out how to proceed then, shouldn't we? Panda asked, raising his hand. Of course, it doesn't matter who we go after. Higuruma and Kashimo have the 100 points we need, and we can use them to add the rules to the list that was initially established. But who will go after whom? To be able to add a rule, a participant in the sacrifice game had to have 100 points to be able to do so. Starting to collect points was a waste of time for Kinji, who had prioritized forcibly taking the points from anyone else who had reached that sum or getting them to join his side, which would give them two strong companions. So we have two options, Kinji held up two fingers in front of the boys. 1. We confront Higuruma or Kashimo and take their points by force, or 2. We manage to convince them to join our side and obtain the points thanks to them being our allies or transferring them to one of us. I'm leaning towards starting with the second, but I have no problem going for the first option. Having them join us is the best route we can take. Yuji joined the conversation, earning questions from all of his classmates. At least, at first. Kenjaku has proven it can have an army of special grade curses and sorcerers at its disposal to carry out its plans. What would make us think that's changed? Probably many of the sorcerers in the colonies are allies of Kenjaku through pacts made or forced by some other method. And if so, there are currently 5 of us. Yuta-senpai is on his way to the Sendai colony. We're going to Tokyo. Maki will be with the Zenin clan. If we count all of us, there are a total of 7 against hundreds. I don't like to be a little pessimistic, but the numbers are against us, and if we count that Kenjaku may have chosen the right sorcerers, then we could be dealing with people from the first grade and above. And we don't have anyone who can deal with a special grade. Yuji was aware of their capabilities. Special grades, both in curses and spells, had overwhelming power, and they had proven it. They even had tricks up their sleeves that could lead to certain death, either through a territorial expansion or a technique that would end up damaging them for a long time, even if it wasn't direct. Taking that into account, the best option was to take any sorcerer who could aid them in battle. Higuruma and Kashimo seemed like a good option to be able to recover Professor Satoru Gojo from Kenjaku's hands and weaken their enemy at the same time, considering they were unaware of the true power Kenjaku held in his hands or that accompanied his subjects. The idea of Kenjaku having allies came from the Shibuya Incident, from how it all started. Kenjaku had been accompanied by various special grade curses like Nanami and Maldito, and he also used rogue sorcerers, witches, to create a screen strong enough to keep them all inside during the battle for Shibuya. Because of this, Yuji doubted that Kenjaku wasn't using the same methods to defeat them and bring his plans to fruition. It's a proper rationing, Megumi admitted, frowning at her companion's thought. This wasn't the Yuji Itadori Megumi had known, the one she had appreciated. He had matured. In many ways. If Kenjaku has the same number of allies, we're going to be short-handed. At least until Okkotsu and Zenin return to the group. Within the Tokyo school, Yuta Okkotsu was a special grade with a power that was considered by the mime Satoru. After the strongest sorcerer, no one in that room doubted that his second-year classmate would be an invaluable ally in that fight, especially considering the boy was barely 16 years old. So, 7 against 10 colonies full of sorcerers from the past and modern. Kinji laughed dryly, finding that certainly amusing. This seems to be against our odds, don't you think? Kinji Hakari began to laugh, sensing the humor in the situation. A group of ordinary undergraduate students were about to enter a battle to rescue a teacher, save a girl from all her trouble, and restore the world. It was completely surreal. This wasn't the Heian era, and it almost seemed as if the war between sorcerers and curses had returned, as if it had never died down over the centuries. That's why we must limit our actions, Megumi murmured, looking at Kinji. If we can avoid a confrontation, it would be best to hide our own abilities from Kenjaku's potential allies or others who wish to harm us. Ah. Some kind of surprise move then. That's kind of interesting what you're proposing, Fushiguro. I think I can get on board with this better then. Saving their strength was one of the many options Megumi kept considering. They weren't familiar with the abilities of many of the colony wizards, and Kashimo and Higuruma were far superior to many of the ordinary wizards, something they backed up with the 100 points they had, making them the only 2 wizards on the list who were considering changing the rules. A sorcerer from the past and a sorcerer from the future, Yuji muttered, looking at his hands. I guess Kenjaku wants to bring together the best to put on a better show. He gritted his teeth, his brow furrowing into an annoyed expression as he faced the cursed sorcerer known as Kenjaku, who was sometimes referred to as Brain. Kenjaku had been responsible for his own birth and was Choso's brother, responsible for the deaths of 2 of his siblings with his own hands. He was annoyed, irritated with the sorcerer. We're going to stop him, Kurara read the atmosphere and spoke to break the tension building around the pink-haired boy. Stopping Kenjaku is the ultimate goal, isn't it? Step by step, we can complete the path to stopping him. First, we need to get Fushiguro's sister out of the way and free Professor Gojo from his confinement. We can do both here, in one move. We must find Angel to free the professor, Panda murmured. Since we don't have the proper tools, Gojo-sensei's own fault, our only option is to obtain Angel, so we can free him. Therefore, I propose that Kinji, Kurara, and I go after Kashimo and Angel while you and Fushiguro go after Higuruma. The 3 of us have experience. You can handle a modern sorcerer who hasn't had the time to adapt to your power and abilities. I support that plan, Kinji raised his hand. I can handle someone like Kashimo if things get complicated with my territorial expansion. We have insurance up our sleeves. Fine, Megumi nodded, accepting Panda's proposal and the reinforcement from Kinji and Kurara, the latter only giving a smile. What do you think, Itadori? Yuji Itadori blinked and stared at his hands for a few moments, trying to think of an alternative path. There were 5 of them. Kinji and Kurara were constantly together, but the latter wasn't a direct combatant and could struggle in various ways during a fight. The best option was to have Panda accompany them, especially given his experience and power. Letting him team up with Megumi was the best case scenario, as the two knew each other and had fought together on some occasions and survived on others. I don't see any downsides to this. It's the best thing to do considering who's here and who's going to be moving around. I assume Panda has taken into account some factors I've thought about. So I won't object at all. Fushiguro and I will go after Higuruma and deal with whatever we can in Tokyo Colony number 1. You guys will deal with Kashimo in Tokyo Colony number 2. After that, the best option would be to regroup with Yuta and Maki and return to Master Tenjin to free Gojo-sensei from his confinement. The objectives on that occasion were clear to the 5 students in that room. The priorities of adding the rules they established with Yuta and Maki to be able to carry out their plans effectively had led them to split up in order to save time. Losing a few minutes in a confrontation could be truly detrimental to everyone. And at the very least, they were aware that effectively stopping Kenjaku would make them move much more slowly than expected in order to pursue the objectives they had set for themselves. They were trying to secure the fate of the world. They were trying to save innocent people. And, with that in mind, Yuji Itadori was willing to sacrifice himself to stop Kenjaku. Chapter 9. November 12, 2018. 5 new members had entered the sacrifice game, splitting between colony number 1 and number 2 in Tokyo, and joining the list of sorcerers on Kenjaku's list, who probably smiled when he saw 2 of the names on the list of the 5 new ones that appeared. Yuji Itadori and Megumi Fushiguro were off-screen above Tokyo colony number 1, standing in front of it, seemingly unwilling to move for a while. Both boys were once again wearing their Tokyo school uniforms, with Yuji wearing the hooded jacket Satoru Gojo himself had given him and his signature sneakers, reminding him of a certain boy from a superhero manga. Beside him, with his hands in his pockets, Megumi looked with her dark eyes at the screen that separated them from the colony and the battle they would soon have. The objective of the 2 boys was simple. Find Hiromi Higuruma inside that colony and obtain the 100 points that the man had earned in his time in the game, which could be a simple task or become complicated and become hell for them. Kinji, Kurara and Panda were in colony number 2 with a similar goal. The 3 of them were after Hajime Kashimo and Angel to get the former's 100 points and the latter's help with Satoru Gojo's imprisonment. Since Angel is the only known sorcerer capable of breaking the confining prison, the 3 of them going after him was something the 2 first years wouldn't have to deal with for long. That is, if everything goes as planned. Megumi's brow furrowed slightly at that thought. They had assumed they would get 100 points from each of the sorcerers and that Angel would end up helping them. But what if one of them lost against Kashimo or Higuruma? What if Angel died before they could find him? With those questions and dark thoughts swirling around in her head, Megumi's mood fluctuated slightly, becoming a little dark and depressing. Bet that face off. Will you? Yuji slapped Megumi's back hard, causing him to almost fall face forward, causing the dark-haired boy to look at his partner with a flat gaze. What are you supposed to do? Twisting his lips, Yuji gave a smile as he placed his hands behind his head, generating an aura of confidence around him that Megumi himself felt reach him. Give you a little encouragement, he said, laughing at his partner's eye roll. Someone has to be the focus of motivation, and it doesn't look like it's going to be you. Yuji was a pleasant, energetic person. That's how Megumi met her teammate. But even though the pink-haired boy was trying to act as radiant as he had before Shibuya, she saw behind Yuji's smile and found the tension and fear deep within his soul. Itadori is carrying Sukuna. Sukuna might be planning something here and Itadori might be dealing with it. Should I keep an eye on him or just let it go? It wasn't just Megumi who was aware of the fact that Yuji was upset, tired, and emotionally hurt after all the people he'd lost and after the Shibuya incident where he'd been possessed by Ryam and Sukuna and left friends and innocent people severely injured. Everyone knew the facts and the weight the battle was having on Yuji, the only one of them who hadn't accepted being a sorcerer, despite having been one since birth. He focused his gaze on the screen, trying to push his thoughts aside and avoid looking at that smile filled with false optimism. It doesn't matter. I can handle this, Itadori. You shouldn't worry about me. Are you sure about that? One of Megumi's eyebrows twitched at that question, which, to his ears, sounded completely stupid. He was worried about Tsumiki, but he couldn't despair because nothing would change. Had Itadori only improved in appearance to others? Absolutely, he muttered, looking at his companion. You should worry about what you're doing. You shouldn't overexert yourself any more than you already are. Kurara was able to accompany me, and you should take a break. Yuji looked at Megumi with several flutters of his eyelashes, followed by a long series of blinks, as if trying to decipher what his companion was thinking or trying to do with those words. He was fine. At least, he could deal with what was on his mind. Until you go completely crazy, brat. Kajijij. I'm fine, Yuji muttered, annoyed by Megumi's words. I can go on for days like this. If you want to fool yourself but you have nothing to lose by taking a step back from time to time, Itadori. Think about it. Yuji collided his right fist with his left palm. Don't worry, Fushiguro. He can handle all of this. Megumi dismissed the idea of continuing to try to convince her partner and massaged her neck lightly. She fixed her dark eyes on Itadori's figure before looking back at the screen. The sorcerers of the present may be a minor problem, but you shouldn't underestimate them. Not if any of them were sorcerers before this event on Kenjaku's part, he said, modulating his voice so that it was firm so Itadori could hear what he had to say clearly, which was not unimportant. The sorcerers of the past can be a problem, especially for us. We don't have the experience or weapons of Hakari or Hashi, nor are we special grade like Okkotsu. Our chances of victory are lower than theirs on a battlefield like this. Staying together is a priority. What if we don't? That. Yuji pointed his index finger at the screen, an idea running through his neurons and fully forming in his mind, becoming annoying. What if we go through that screen and we get separated? How are you sure Kenjaku didn't think of something similar? He took a deep breath before continuing, formulating his idea in words. Kenjaku may have foreseen that we would fight him. That's something even a major villain would do. So what if we go through the screen and we get separated, Fushiguro? That's most likely if Kenjaku's intention is to stop us and prevent us from stopping his plan or rescuing Gojo-sensei. That's what I would do. Megumi blinked a few times, registering Yuji's words for processing. Even for him, what Yuji had said made perfect sense. Kenjaku had probably added some functionality to the screens placed in each of the 10 colonies established in Japan for the sacrifice game. And separating them seemed like as good a function as any. If that's the case, young Fushiguro slowly began, accepting Yuji's idea as completely valid, then you'll have to fight on your own and survive. You can't leave all the work to me, can you? The pink-haired boy blinked and then smiled at Megumi's words, who scratched his nose and hid his embarrassment at those words of encouragement that he never imagined saying in his life, much less to a classmate. Yeah. Megumi glanced at Yuji out of the corner of her eye and felt that something had changed in her companion again. The positive aura had vanished, and an aura of confidence and determination enveloped him instead, making him look like a man and not a 15-year-old teenager, almost as if he had grown several years in that moment. Even his posture changed to that of an adult, with his back straight, shoulders squared, and no weakness in his posture. His eyes were burning. Okay. Shall we go in, Itadori? Yuji took a huge breath and patted his face to get rid of any trace of doubt, changing into a bright and determined smile. Come on, Megumi. The two boys began to walk slowly toward the screen, their faces showing the determination their eyes reflected intensely, almost glowing like two bonfires in their eyes, which never blinked. But the second they entered Tokyo Colony No. 1, the pink-haired boy's words came true and they were separated from each other, with Yuji falling from the sky, as if he had been teleported there. Kenjaku hadn't put that rule on the screen on a whim or out of concern for the small group of students trying to stop his plans and rescue Satoru Gojo. He made that demand on the screen for a different reason. To make it much more fun to watch, to turn hunters into prey and prey into hunters, leaving them all as alone as possible and without support from their classmates. That sacrificial game had to give Kenjaku the best results so he could assimilate Tenjin with all of humanity, taking the next step in evolution. Therefore, the fights were essential to accumulate cursed energy from each of the colonies and use it in his plan to assimilate Tenjin with humanity as a whole. The fighters couldn't be allowed to sit out the fight. That wasn't on the agenda. Moving nimbly, Yuji Itadori covered himself with his arms and enveloped his body in cursed energy, intensifying his muscles, and crashed into a building, leaving a huge hole in the wall and a shower of dust, debris, and glass behind him, but remaining completely unharmed from a fall of several meters in height, indicating that his body was much tougher. That could have killed someone else, he declared as he stood up, looking up at the sky through the hole. Did Fushiguro fall like me, or was he luckier? He scratched the back of his neck lightly as he walked to the edge of the gap in the wall and looked down. If his head was correct, he'd probably fallen a total of about 30 meters before crashing into the building that saved him from being completely crushed against the asphalt. And I avoided that woman. Yuji's face lifted and he looked at a long-haired woman who seemed to be shaped like a kite, with dark aviator glasses covering her eyes, staring at him. Her displeasure at having failed was evident, even from a distance. Well. Megumi told me to be careful, and that woman almost hit me. He cracked his neck slightly. He shifted his eyes slightly toward another figure. A helicopter man. The two figures seemed to be arguing in the air, not looking at him, but then they turned their attention to him, and Yuji knew they were talking about him between them, which gave the boy the information he needed about both of them. They were a team. It wasn't unusual for sorcerers to form teams when they could die. It was even less unusual for them to do so in a battle like the sacrifice game. It was one of the premises Yuji and his teammates kept in mind, and he prepared accordingly in the moments before entering the game. "I hope Fushiguro had a better ride than I did," he muttered, watching the woman hurtle toward him like a projectile. "Because this has been such a mess for me." Yuji stepped aside and let the woman walk through a few floors of the multi-story building, eventually coming out the other side and causing the building's structural columns to give way as she walked through, causing the building to collapse on itself and split in two at the same time. "Shit." Yuji Itadori ran and leaped out of the collapsing building, contracting his legs and covering himself with his arms to form the shape of a cannonball. He once again crashed through a huge window, this one in the building behind the first one. He skidded, somersaulted, and came to a slight crouch, hearing the building in front of him fall on itself, and a huge cloud of dust fill the street. Both of them can attack from a distance, but they don't look like sorcerers from 400 years ago or more. I'd say they're modern sorcerers and don't have the extensive experience that Fushiguro, Kujisaki, or Gojo-sensei have. I can handle this. The flame of determination appeared in the teenager's brown eyes. He smiled confidently, twisting his lips and clenched his fists tightly, the veins standing out. He was going to survive. Chapter 10. A new battle was raging in Tokyo Colony No. 1. On one side was Yuji Itadori, a first-year student at Tokyo Metropolitan High School, a sorcerer with 3 months of experience, whose curse king was being restrained by his own body. On the other side were a woman and a man of unknown names, with limited experience using their curse techniques, and who had only fought within the colony itself, being modern, newly awakened sorcerers. One might think the teenager was at a disadvantage. The man and woman had techniques that allowed them to soar through the skies and evade any short and medium range attacks, forcing anyone to attack them from a long distance, which would allow both of them to move and evade any projectiles inflicted on them. This gave them a huge advantage over any enemy novice. Yuji Itadori had fought worse than modern sorcerers or modern sorcerers. The fight with the curse that forced him to eat Sukuna's finger, or the one that made him bring Sukuna out of him to save Megumi. There was also the time he fought the humans transformed by Maldito and against Maldito himself. Or when he fought his own siblings, Kichizu and Iso, alongside Nobara. Or when he fought Hanami during the school transfer. And, most recently, when he survived a battle in Shibuya that left hundreds dead and wounded. The difference between the man and the woman and the teenager was the experience and the traumatic moments they had lived through. While both adults were marked by Kenjaku, Yuji had become fully involved in a war and a struggle that he could have avoided if he wanted to, but that wasn't the case. And he wasn't a person to shy away from trouble once he was in it and had a goal in mind. There, standing on a rooftop, Yuji Itadori looked up at the sky and fixed his brown eyes on the figures of the two adults, showing them a determined face that could have caused fear if it weren't a teenager holding said face. But the boy was dangerous wasn't on either man's or woman's mind. The pair had formed a partnership to survive that battle and attack the fledglings who entered the colony, and that was how they viewed Yuji. A fledgling who wouldn't be able to fight much longer after they finished him off. Arrogance. Self-centeredness. Both sentiments radiated from the adults in the sky, who looked at Yuji as if he were their next prey, their next target, and that the boy would be helpless to avoid being struck. Perhaps that would have worked for them before. Yuji was able to recognize that before Shibuya, his own determination to fight to the death was severely limited and that he wouldn't just kill anyone he fought. That cost him the loss to Choso and many moments that hurt his own mentality and self-esteem. But he had survived Shibuya and had goals in mind, such as helping his comrades in the war against Kenjaku. This Yuji Itadori fought until his last breath. The kid's finally grown up a bit, huh Brad? Inside, young Ryaman, Sukuna had been watching the changes in his container with growing interest and confusion, not understanding what was wrong with the boy. During the fight with Naoya Zenin and then Yuta Okkotsu, something had filled him with irrational fear and had taken up residence in his head for a few moments. But why would he, the king of curses, be afraid of a human with so little experience as a sorcerer and without a ritual? Sukuna was intrigued by this and had been observing the changes in the boy's mentality and his own personality, which seemed to become sharper and more serious at certain moments. The fight between Yuji and Kinji also caught his attention and remained etched in his retina. The boy stored the King of Curses words deep within his mind, then placed a double lock on the boy with a full lock and threw him into the abyss. If Sukuna weren't a monster, he would have even praised what the boy was doing, but that only made Yuji grow slightly frustrated, finding it ironic that the boy didn't respond to his mocking comments. Feeling the wind shift and a gust hit his face, Yuji rolled out of the way of the plain woman and rolled on the ground, now standing in a corner of the roof, staring at the woman's back and then returning his eyes to the man. The technique that transforms her hair into something like a kite, making her an airplane woman. The other seems to have a ritual that transforms her hair into helicopter propellers. In itself, its use and danger are non-existent. Especially considering they have no experience in the field. Yuji analyzed his two enemies and quickly realized that the danger they represented was almost non-existent or probably completely non-existent for him. The rituals they had performed didn't affect him and only changed the hair of the two adults. If he added the fact that they were inexperienced and hadn't had time to practice with the technique they'd received, he had a 100% chance of winning against them. So the brat has found a better way to use his mind. Have you suddenly become smart, kid? Teasing filled his mind, along with a cruel voice coming from Sukuna, who was trying to get his attention and distract him. But again, Yuji shook off the Curse King's words and moved forward, leaning his body slightly forward, leaving him bent over a little. He was reading the situation, the movements, and the timing. When the plain woman swooped down, he leaped and charged a divergent punch that he sent against the sorceress's back, sending all his force to make the woman crash to the ground after passing through 4 or 5 floors, reaching the basement of that building, leaving behind enormous holes that formed a tunnel. "Hanyu." The man's shout caught the young sorcerer's attention and he gave him the woman's name, which seemed to be Hanyu. Although there was still a chance that name was completely false or that the man was making one up. But one look at the short man's angry face told Yuji that wasn't the case in this situation. "Your friend isn't going to get up," he said, looking up from the hole at the man with the helicopter hair. "I've analyzed the entire fight and what might happen. I even added the factor of your rituals and what I've seen you do with them. I'm sorry to tell you, you can't win this battle. I'm not a noob." He might have sounded self-centered and arrogant with those words, but to him, they were the reality and the undeniable fact. He was convinced that the woman had been brought down and that the man would soon follow, based on the information he had gathered. Why would he be wrong? "You're a little brat, aren't you?" The man clenched his jaw, making the line of it more visible. "I'm going to have to teach you a lesson and then tell Hanyu off. She led me to this, after all." Yuji watched the man's tirade without changing his posture. He stood upright, his arms stretched out at his sides, and his eyes fixed on his enemy who was within his field of vision. He knew the woman, whom the man called Hanyu, wasn't going to get up. He'd struck the center of her back with the double blow force of the divergent fist, sending her flying through the air until she crashed to the ground and was buried beneath a pile of rubble. People like Satoru Gojo, Choso, Yuta Okkotsu, Maki Zenin, they could survive something as simple as that. But humans turned sorcerers with no experience or notable use of cursed energy, just to use their rituals. It was clear to Yuji that Hanyu was defeated with that simple blow and that her partner would follow soon after, even if he had to come up with a better strategy. "The woman was moving at me like a projectile. A simple strategy like this was better with her because she was always on my tail. The man, on the other hand, is more of a helicopter and my best option is a devastating blow that ends the fight. If I can manage, I could move around and hinder the guy and block his movement for a direct hit with cursed energy." Slowly, piece by piece, the plan took shape in the student's mind until the image became all too clear to Yuji. At that moment, though, the student jumped into the hole Hanyu's body had created, grabbing onto the edge and standing on the right side of the building, watching as the man entered through the same hole and looked down at him. "If all goes well, he'll try to cut me into chunks of minced meat." Taking a deep breath, the student unwound the nerves in his forelimbs, ready to move whenever he wanted, whenever he needed to, and the moment called for it, which wasn't going to take long to happen. The adult sorcerer's hair turned into propellers at the man's command. Forming an arrogant, mocking smile, he began to spin the propellers in a circular motion and lean toward the boy, his propellers breaking the walls as he moved forward, like a giant fan. "I'm going to tear you apart, you bucking brat." The situation was dangerous. Even though the man's ritual couldn't cause direct harm, that didn't mean his helix-shaped hair couldn't cut a person into hundreds of tiny pieces of flesh. Something Yuji had previously concluded when analyzing the two adults' techniques. But it was also dangerous to use the technique in that situation. The short sorcerer was forced to move in only one direction if he wanted to damage him, leaving unprotected the only weak point that interested Yuji. The man's head, the axis of that propeller of dark hair. Having to advance forward, towards where he was, the man could not dodge the blow, which was an advantage for the pink-haired boy, who retracted his arm and began to concentrate cursed energy for a direct blow from divergent fist that would end up taking him out of the battle. "I just have to wait for the right moment." The seconds passed slowly, one after another, and the helicopter man came closer, destroying and leaving marks on the walls, as if some kind of cutter had been passed through them. And the moment arrived. Yuji let the air out of his lungs and punched the man on the crown of his head with overwhelming force, generating a second blow, followed by the precursor of the divergent fist, sending a cramping sensation through his opponent's body, who finally fell to the ground completely unconscious. "I guess that's it," he muttered, waggling his hand slightly. Hitting the enemy sorcerer's head could have caused his own hand to break. If he hadn't made the cursed energy denser, it probably would have. But I haven't asked them about Higuruma. Not one of them. When Yuji went to wake the man up, a male voice stopped him. I can take you to that man, Yuji Itadori. The sorcerer turned and looked at a boy his age, with light hair that reached the nape of his neck. Just you must follow me. Chapter 11. The Ikebukuro Theater had become Hiromi Higuruma's base of operations, the target of Megumi and Yuji. The latter, however, was accompanied by Nanami, a boy from his hometown who had recognized him by his high school nickname. It was Rin who had taken him to Ikebukuro and guided him to the theater from where Higuruma had defeated anyone who had sought him out, including Haba, the helicopter-type Yuji had defeated a few hours earlier with his partner Hanya, leaving both adults unconscious. The Ikebukuro Theater appeared to have suffered damage to its facade. Some of the letters on the enormous sign had disappeared, leaving a few gaps to be filled. The remaining letters were slightly loose, almost fallen off, and seemed to be hanging by a single screw or thread, depending on who looked at it. It looked like an abandoned theater to the sorcerer student. Although it had only been a few days since the sacrifice game had been made public, buildings in general had deteriorated in appearance within one of the colonies, but this theater was slightly more battered. Aside from the sign, the paint was damaged, and the structure showed some small cracks that could become much larger. Inside, there had likely been some intense fights between Higuruma and his rivals or anyone who entered his territory. Just as the place was a good place to remain unnoticed, the theater offered a good setting for a confrontation between sorcerers, without forcing Higuruma to leave those four walls, allowing him to carry out his activities inside, without having to go out to look for his targets. And Yuji sensed that the man wasn't hiding from anyone. In fact, his presence became even more obvious once they approached the area where the man was. Shaking his head, Yuji decided to go inside. He'd been considering going in search of Megumi, but that would take a lot more time, and that was precisely what they didn't have. He had to take Higuruma himself if he wanted to get the sorcerer's points as soon as possible, and not waste any more time in that place. Are you sure you want to do it? Standing to Yuji's right, Nanami looked at the pink-haired teenager with some concern. Hiromi Higuruma had once defeated Haba, but since then, the boy hadn't heard of anyone being able to defeat the lawyer before that moment. Just because Yuji had defeated Haba and Hanya didn't mean he could defeat Hiromi. Yes. Why? I told you he beat Haba, Rin muttered through gritted teeth. Even if you beat him, Higuruma's been fighting for a while and has reached 100 points. Are you sure you want to risk it? Yuji didn't take his eyes off the theater door. Memories of his time with Junpei, Nanami, Nobara, Aoi, and Professor Satoru flashed through his mind. 2 of those people were dead. 2 of them were in a situation unknown to him. And the last one, the one who could stop everything that was happening, was in the hands of the enemy, sealed in a prison capable of holding infinity. Facing Higuruma wasn't as monstrous in his mind as the situation of all the people he had met and who had become important to him. It doesn't matter if it's dangerous, he began walking. He placed his hands on the double-leaf door and pushed, producing a creaking sound that indicated the doors were opening and giving way under his force. But I have to do it. The interior of the theater was in a similar state to the exterior facade. Peeling paint could be seen. Cracks ran along the walls and floor. And craters adorned the walls, ceiling, and floor itself. Chairs and seats were scattered everywhere, turning the floor into an obstacle course for anyone, obstructing their path. And, at the back of all that mess, stood a man with slightly disheveled dark hair with strands sticking out, wearing a suit that made him look like a businessman, a lawyer, or an entrepreneur. Hiromi Higuruma. Yuji Itadori stopped several feet away from the man, who stared at him with a lifeless, emotionless gaze, as if he weren't looking directly at him. A second later, after a blink, the man fixed his small, black eyes on Yuji's figure. The man had raised his head. He was lying in a bathtub full of water. Have you ever taken a shower with your clothes on? The man began to climb out of the tub, causing the water to ripple and make a loud splash as his feet hit the wooden stage floor. I never did. Oh. It felt better than I expected, the man admitted with a sigh. Even with wet underwear, I'm not uncomfortable. The teenager blinked at that statement, frowning at the words of the man in front of him, feeling completely strange and out of place. Hiromi Higuruma, Yuji's voice came out more serious than usual, probably due to the circumstances under which he had ended up meeting the man. At this call, Hiromi looked at the boy with some confusion and questioning. I need you to help me end the sacrifice game. I'm asking you please. There are many people who. Oh, and here I was thinking you'd come to fight or for my head, boy. He readjusted his tie with an upward tug, feeling the knot brush against his Adam's apple. But you've come to eliminate the sacrifice game. For altruism. Yuji took a step back, surprised by Hiromi's gaze. Why yeah, more or less. The sigh escaped Hiromi's mouth, who looked at Yuji with a serious look. I'm not going to help you, kid. Why? Why? What would I gain by getting rid of this game beyond more people being unjustly punished? The man shook his head. No, it doesn't make sense to me, kid. I've been delivering justice because just men have never been able to. Or haven't really. Leaving innocent people to rot in prison. Whatever. I guess money is what drives people's interests in this society, don't you think? I'm better off with this situation, kid. At least I can leave a little justice. Hiromi Higuruma was unhappy. A person he had defended was unjustly sentenced to prison, and the people who were supposed to represent justice did absolutely nothing to stop it. Why stop this moment in history where he could exact his own justice? It wasn't on his agenda. Hiromi was busy delivering justice, and he would continue to be so for a long time, as long as this game continued. Yuji gritted his teeth, meeting Hiromi's gaze with what the man was thinking. He wasn't going to help him. No words could convince him, no actions could break his will. Hiromi Higuruma was determined to follow his own words and will, and he wasn't going to work with them to end Kenjaku's game, which left him with only one option. I need the 100 points, Hiromi Higuruma, he murmured, charging forward. And if not by fair means, then by foul means. Hiromi was not surprised. That's something you would do. A dark figure appeared behind Hiromi, slowly taking shape. Domain expansion. Forced suicide penalty. Yuji's leg stopped beside the man's head, inches from touching. With a gesture, Hiromi made Yuji jump back, but the lawyer only showed a folder. This is an expansion. The domain expansion was an advanced sorcery technique that had grown over the centuries. There were two types of expansions. Those inherited through a family line or a curse technique, and those that a sorcerer without a line could create with enough strength. If Hiromi had an expansion, Yuji was certain the lawyer was among the strongest sorcerers in Tokyo Colony No. 1, maybe even in Japan. You cannot fight within my domain, Yuji Itadori. He jerked his thumb at his Shikigami. He is my Shikigami. You can call him Judge if you are looking for a name. The teenager's brown eyes looked at the dark figure with 2 points on each side and one on the bottom, both of which acted as the Shikigami's legs and arms. Its face, what looked like a white mask, showed closed eyes. He will be the judge of this trial, boy. The trial created by cursed energy where Hiromi was the prosecution's lawyer, the Shikigami the judge and Yuji the accused, a role that all the lawyer's enemies held and that was now being played by the young sorcerer. Okay. According to the evidence presented, on July 16, 2017, in Sensai, you entered the Panchiko parlor called Maji Vegas as a minor. How do you plead? This is stupid. I came in to use the bathroom. One of Hiromi's eyebrows raised. Are you sure? A photo appeared in front of Yuji, showing him using the currency exchange machine in the living room. I don't think this is a bathroom. TCH. There's no way to get a not guilty verdict, man. The photographic evidence only showed you using the machine. The parlors and the exchange houses aren't part of the same entity, kid. Yuji braced himself when he saw the judge move slightly behind Hiromi, becoming somewhat larger than the boy remembered. Could it have become even darker? You are hereby found guilty. You will be stripped of the cursed energy. That. Hiromi cracked her neck slightly at her Shikigami's sentence, starting to walk toward the teenager as her expansion began to unravel. There was a gap between him and Yuji right now, a huge one that the lawyer was going to bridge. Let's begin. But again, something hit the boy's chest. Yuji reacted to Hiromi's movement by leaping backward, gaining a huge distance, surprising the man. Hiromi moved forward and summoned the mace in her right hand, transforming it into a warhammer-sized weapon. She swung the tool to crush Yuji, but the boy responded by returning a crushing blow that left him exposed. He hit the mallet with that force without any cursed energy. Hiromi had planned for a quick victory against the teenager and would take his points. The boy shouldn't die unnecessarily, and defeating him was the best thing she could do for him. But she hadn't expected Yuji to respond to her attack with that counterattack that made him move his arm slightly back when his tool was moved in the direction of the blow. There was no cursed energy behind the blow. Yuji didn't have a curse technique to respond to Hiromi's force, nor did he have a domain expansion to counter his opponents. Without cursed energy, the 15-year-old first year at Tokyo Metropolitan High School responded to the lawyer's aggression with his own natural brute strength, surprising Hiromi and taking advantage of the opportunity to strike her stomach with a spinning elbow strike that sent the man tumbling into his bathtub. Hiromi spun in the air and landed on his feet, feeling something snap, causing him to clutch his chest. Did he have a broken rib? His ribsage. Hiromi gritted his teeth, pushing that to the back of his mind and gripping the mallet tightly, mentally declaring that the boy wouldn't catch him off guard again. But when Hiromi Higuruma looked at the teenager, the enormous figure of a wolf seemed to take its place, revealing predatory yellow eyes. The battle between Yuji Itadori and Hiromi Higuruma had just begun. Chapter 12. Two figures moved within the Ikebukuro theater at speeds faster than human speed. Without cursed energy, Yuji wasn't amplifying his body's strength or the speed at which his senses or muscles reacted to each movement. He was doing everything naturally, evading the striking attempts of Hiromi Higuruma, his adversary, and the reason he couldn't use the cursed energy in his counterattacks. But as on previous occasions, the first-year student deflected the mace with a punch that would have shocked the man had he not done it before, just before that moment, leaving Hiromi exactly as she was. With a bewildered look. Hiromi Higuruma had been a lawyer who grew dissatisfied with the judicial system, so he was one of the people forced to participate in the sacrificial game when his ritual was awakened, giving the man the chance to exact justice his way. Tokyo Colony No. 1 had become Hiromi's field of justice, and he had proven it by earning 100 points, placing himself above many modern sorcerers, despite having no prior experience. Because of her experience with other sorcerers, Hiromi found it strange that Yuji was able to respond to blows forcefully and wasn't being overwhelmed by his own strength and superiority. What exactly was the boy doing? Would his expansion have been ineffective against a teenager? Well, that was a possibility, Hiromi vehemently denied it. It was impossible. The judge had passed judgment on the pink-haired boy and the rules were being followed. Yuji Itadori couldn't use cursed energy. So how was he standing his ground and dodging or countering her mace's blows? One fact Hiromi didn't know was that Yuji already possessed superhuman strength before manipulating the cursed energy, even before eating one of Sukuna's fingers and becoming its vessel. He was born with it and it was inherent to his body, making him, in a way, like Maki Zenin or Toji Fushiguro. Both, young and old, were in a technical tie. Yuji lacked the experience to best Hiromi, but at the same time, Hiromi lacked the experience to be able to damage someone without completely overpowering them. Perhaps the lawyer had cursed energy, but the young sorcerer possessed physical power, which he used freely and without remorse, deflecting the gavel's blows with his knuckles, which were reddening from the numerous deflections he'd had to make. Another unknown fact for Hiromi, which earned her a direct jab to the ribs, was Yuji's physical and martial arts skills. Although he didn't have a defined style, nor had he followed a single branch of martial arts, something that would have made him a killing weapon, he knew many concepts and movements from a wide range of fighting styles, which he used extensively to defend himself against the lawyer's attempts to change him. Who grew frustrated with the young man who was standing firm in the courtroom. Yuji knew they were short on time. Megumi would be searching for him and Hiromi Higuruma to get the 100 points, and at the same time, Kinji, Hakari and Panda would be searching for Angel so they could free Professor Gojo. And while they were doing that, Kenjaku was still free, working on his own plan. Letting out his sigh, Yuji bent his leg slightly and let his body fall into a slightly crouched position, arms open as if waiting for something. It was, in the eyes of any expert, a stance without guard, with many open points and perfect for being hit. But at the same time, it was a death trap for those accustomed to physical combat. The open stance, which even Maki used at one point, was the perfect invitation for people who believed in their superiority. And this time, it was no different. Hiromi, completely naive to this due to his inexperience with martial arts, grabbed the handle of the mallet and shot towards Yuji Itadori, swinging his cursed tool, delivering a blow that left the openings in the man's defense that he had been waiting for. As his eyes saw them, Yuji twisted and disappeared beneath Hiromi's defense, slamming his elbow into the man's chest, spinning on his feet as he fell backward, and delivering a downward blow with his closed fist to the lawyer's sternum, slamming him into the ground with all the non-lethal force possible, causing Hiromi to spit blood upwards. He jumped away from his opponent. Yuji had reacted professionally to Hiromi's move. And he had acted like a professional, striking back and acting like a true martial artist, using the lawyer's strength and momentum to his advantage to strike with the appropriate intensity, even though it hadn't caused or would cause his death. The teenager's main intention was to disable Hiromi and obtain the 100 points she had, not to kill him unnecessarily. Spitting out some blood, Hiromi began to stand up and brought his hand to his chest. The first year had caused a couple of his ribs to break and tore something inside him, likely causing some internal injuries. Was it possible for a 15-year-old boy to move and act like a professional wrestler? Hiromi didn't know the answer, but he didn't like where this confrontation was going. He had expected the boy to be another modern sorcerer, another inexperienced one who, without cursed energy, could have destroyed him in a matter of 2 moves. That hadn't been the case. Yuji was well versed in the world of sorcerers and was behaving like someone willing to fight without cursed energy, following his own line and intentions. Sigh. That blow had hurt and he had to admit it. The 15-year-old had caught him off guard and he hadn't expected a move like that from someone with little martial arts experience. And he had completely underestimated him. However, it wasn't something that would happen again anytime soon. With an intense look at Yuji, Hiromi placed the mace back on her shoulder and wiped the blood running down her chin with the back of her hand. "Well, kid," he said, breathing with some difficulty, an act brought on by his injured ribs. "You don't have cursed energy, but you're someone who's willing to keep fighting even without it. And you've dealt me a blow to be reckoned with. I didn't expect it, Yuji Itadori." Yuji allowed himself a smile at Hiromi's words. "Oh, I have plenty more where that came from, Higuruma-san." There was a certain arrogance and ego in those words. Hiromi smiled in amusement at the thought of Yuji as self-centered, something that even surprised Sukuna, but none of the sorcerers knew it, nor did it seem important. But it doesn't matter if you land 1 or 2 hits. If you don't knock me down, I'll keep fighting. Hiromi launched herself at Yuji, but with her body slightly at an angle, avoiding too many openings. She wasn't one to make the same mistakes twice. She swung the mallet in a sweeping motion, smashing the ground where the teen had been standing, generating a shower of tile fragments, obscuring his vision for a few seconds, causing him to click his tongue. Those seconds were used by the teen, who launched a direct kick at Hiromi and forced him to cover himself with his left arm, almost dropping the mallet. He closed his fingers, made it smaller, and launched an uppercut. The two separated. Yuji looked for a second at the mace in Hiromi's hand, seeing how it had become smaller. It seemed to respond to changes in size at the will of its wielder, something Hiromi was taking advantage of at opportune moments. If she hadn't turned the mace into a small one to hit him, he would have launched a reaping kick directly at his head, which could have cracked something in the man's skull, so he sighed in relief to see that he had protected himself in time. Hiromi looked at her left hand. It was shaking, her entire arm was. Was it because of the boy's strength? She shook her head and closed her hand, trying to get rid of the trembling. She focused her eyes on Yuji Itadori and sent all her thoughts toward the teenager, who seemed to be thinking about something. "What are you thinking about, Itadori?" "Oh." The boy snapped out of his reverie, pounding his right fist into his left palm. "I think I'll appeal the judgment." There was no need for a summoning or expanding the domain as Hiromi had done initially. Her domain expansion took full effect the moment Yuji thought of an appeal in court, enveloping both sorcerers in Hiromi's domain and bringing the 15-year-old to the bench, who blinked at the sight of himself once again before the judge. A new folder was in front of the lawyer. "Ah, this time you're being blamed for the Shibuya incident. Nearly 100 or more people injured or killed, both civilians and sorcerers. According to this, you destroyed Shibuya with a devastating attack that left many with truly deep wounds. How do you plead?" Hiromi's eyes lit up as he read the report on the damage done to Shibuya. He, like many others, knew it was the work of Ryam and Sukuna, the Curse King who had taken over the teenager when he devoured one of his fingers and was now much stronger, having ingested 15 to date. It was surprising that someone like Yuji could maintain control of his body. Culpable. The lawyer blinked and looked at Yuji Itadori in confusion, frowning seconds later. "Guilty? What do you mean, guilty?" he murmured, looking from the report folder to the teenager. "Are you blaming yourself for what happened in Shibuya?" "Yes. That's what I'm saying." The boy's gaze became somewhat more serious, filled with a pain that was reflected in the brightness of his brown eyes. "I'm to blame for not being able to stop him and for having allowed all of this. My hands are stained with the blood of all the people who fell in Shibuya. I am to blame for all those deaths attributed to me. Conflict of ideals." Higuruma looked at the boy and gritted his teeth. He could feel the judge about to find him guilty of all of this and sentence him to death. Yuji had admitted everything and there was no going back. But he couldn't allow that. Not when it was supposedly because of something similar that made him dissatisfied with the law. Shit, the hold crumbled and the two returned to the Ikebukuro theater, Yuji showing surprise. "I guess I can hear you out a bit now, kid. What exactly was it you wanted from me? Let's drop the hostilities and talk now that you've made me see something with my own eyes that I'd forgotten." Chapter 13. There were 4 people stationed on the hospital rooftop. 2 boys and 2 girls. Yuji had convinced Hiromi to join his side in the war and the lawyer had given them his 100 points so they could change one of the rules of the sacrifice game. Meanwhile, Megumi had located Angel inside Hana Kurusu's body, who had decided not to take control of the body and erase the teenager's consciousness, preferring to work with her instead. This was underscored by the attitudes of the various sorcerers from ancient times. The kindest, without a doubt, was Angel to the 2 teenagers from the Tokyo school, who were a little surprised that the sorcerer hadn't taken over the girl's body. The sorcerers who had returned to life from a time when Kenjaku made the pacts 1,000 years before the current point in history had taken control of the bodies where they had been reincarnated, although this was a term that none of the sorcerers were sure to use since they were not exactly the sorcerers of yesteryear but were only their consciousness in the bodies of current people. And they were dangerous. Modern-day awakened sorcerers like Higuruma were among a far too large number of people who were awakened through ritual to become modern sorcerers. But just because they were the largest didn't mean they were the strongest. After Yuji's 2 fights in the colony, he discovered that Higuruma had a real talent for it, a power that could match that of a top-tier sorcerer, and all without knowing anything about the supernatural world. Yuji, Megumi, Hana, and Tsumiki were on the rooftop of the hospital where the freshman stepsister had been staying. They now had enough points to make the rule change that would allow them to remove the girl from the game. That had been one of their goals. I'm going to transfer the points to you, Yuji Itadori murmured. The boy had dropped Hiromi off at the theater where he'd met him after their fight. The man had promised to be on his side when the war against Kenjaku began, and the teenager had no indication that Hiromi would do anything other than what she'd promised. With this, Tsumiki Fushiguro looked at his stepbrother. Yuji had transferred the points to him, and he could add a rule to those slipped in by the master of the sacrifice game. He could add any rule that didn't violate the others and that the game itself deemed prudent to include on the list. I want to change a rule, his voice came out as a barely audible murmur. I want to add a rule, rather, he pointed out, raising his gaze. I want wizards to be able to move between colonies. It was at that instant that the other three boys felt it. An unpleasant sensation filled Yuji's body and left him static for the next few seconds. Megumi's dark eyes took the shape of two enormous plates at the image they were seeing. In front of them, in front of the three of them, Tsumiki laughed as if she were unhinged, as if she were completely crazy, as if she had completely lost her sanity. When Tsumiki looked at the teenagers, the eyes that had been Megumi's sisters had completely disappeared and now the darkened glow was that of an ancient sorceress. You. Oh, it's so good to be back. She cried, throwing off the blanket that had covered her body while she was sitting in the wheelchair. Tsumiki reacted to Yuji's movement and knocked him to the ground, surpassing Megumi's reaction by several seconds. Having a body again is one of the best things that could have happened. Having a life again will give me a way to unite with the only man I've ever loved. Angel was the only one of the four to understand Tsumiki's words. That sorceress in Megumi's sister's body was talking about the same person he was chasing. Ryom and Sukuna, the king of curses. I guess it's time you showed up, honey. A few months ago, in order to return to life, Yuji Itadori made a pact with the being inside his body. Ryom and Sukuna, the most powerful being in the world of sorcery known to date. This pact gave Sukuna a time limit to perform certain actions without his container being able to react or prevent him, all as part of his own desires. Ah, Yorozu, two extra eyes appeared on the face that had been Yuji Itadori's. Dark markings like tribal tattoos took shape, enhancing the madness of evil-filled eyes and a poison-filled smile. I suppose I'd also end up seeing you in a situation like this. Megumi positioned herself. The only option she had was to summon the strongest Shikigami in her arsenal, a Shikigami Sukuna already knew. And the Curse King made his choice at that moment, launching himself at Megumi, to Hana's surprise, who didn't know how to react to the Curse King's screams. The cursed energy molded itself into one of Sukuna's fingers, who fearlessly plucked it from his hand and forced Megumi to swallow it like a pill. The teenager's dark eyes took on a gleam of fear, while the demon's eyes took on a gleam of sardonic mockery. A second later, Sukuna took his place inside Megumi Fushiguro's body, and Yuji Itadori blinked at what his brown eyes were seeing. His best friend turned into the demon he was carrying. When? It's a really complex process, although very simple when you're a sorcerer of a certain level, air left Sukuna's mouth as he spoke through Megumi's body. You've stopped being my vessel and now this boy, your best friend, is my vessel, boy. You've lost. Ryom and Sukuna was cruel and mocking. He mocked Yuji's desperation when he killed thousands of people in the Shibuya Incident. He mocked the teenager's indecision in countless situations, at the most crucial moments in his history as a sorcerer. To him, Yuji Itadori was nothing more than a stepping stone, an instrument in that war that had already served its purpose. To him, Yuji was just a talentless brat. What was bothering him? Yuji's mind entered a trance. Images of Nobara, Megumi, Junpei, Nanami, Professor Gojo and many other classmates flashed through his mind. All those injured in Shibuya were in his mind. All his classmates were there for him. And Sukuna was just making fun of him and using him to hurt another of his classmates. Enveloping his fist in cursed energy, Yuji struck Sukuna in a split second, with the strongest divergent fist yet, surpassing Sukuna's own image of the teenager. The Curse King waited for the boy's despair, too great a shock to see him cry. But the first-year student just hit him with his best punch, his eyes blank, as if they had lost all life, and he were a mere automaton. Brat. He frowned. He felt blood dripping from his split lip, like his body hadn't reacted as he expected. But had the boy really hit him as if he weren't a monster from 1,000 years ago, as if he didn't possess the power of 15 of his fingers? Using his right hand, Sukuna wiped the blood from his split lip and observed it for a second. Had he made a mistake by switching bodies? That question was ridiculous, and so he just laughed. Ha 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 ha. Even I have such unrealistic thoughts. He fixed his eyes on the boy who had been his vessel. There was no cheerful sparkle, there wasn't that feeling of childhood around him. When Sukuna laid his 4 eyes on Yuji when he wiped his blood, he saw the wild glint of a wolf in the boy's shadow. Nice intimidation trick, kid. Shut up, walk slowly, and make the sun stretch your shadow so far that it takes the form of a wolf. Even see that yellowish glow. I guess you're good at making shadow shapes. Sukuna raised his right arm, but he felt the force of the blow. It was stronger than he had expected. His arm trembled after the boy's fist hit it and his ears could hear a faint crack. Yuji didn't respond the way Sukuna had expected. He'd expected tears, despair. But the boy had attacked him without hesitation, as if on autopilot after leaving his body, and he didn't even seem to notice. Not even his eyes showed him what he was thinking or what he was willing to do. "Hana, you have to do it." Yuji skidded in time and jumped, evading Sukuna's slash. The next second, a beam of golden light fell upon the King of Curses, enveloping him completely, causing him to scream in pain, as if he were suffering the worst of punishments. "I guess that's Angel's power." With his eyes glowing slightly in annoyance and his brow furrowed in anger, Yuji seemed to have regained control of his body, his eyes already glowing. It seemed the beam of light energy had brought him back to his senses. "No. Don't do it, Hana." Slowly, the dark marks faded from Megumi's face. The extra eyes disappeared and the pain was only reflected in the boy's dark ones. "Don't stop, Hana. Not now. Listen to the boy, Hana." But doubts were passing through Hana's mind and showing in her eyes. She was one of the people Megumi had rescued when he was a sorcerer. Why was he hurting her? He had already killed Sukuna and he wasn't present in the boy's body. Slowly, the beam faded and the girl plopped down beside the fallen Megumi Fushiguro, flashing him a smile. Crying, Megumi hugged Hana. "Thank you. Thank you for being such an idiot." "Ah." He flexed his legs. Using his body strength, he slammed his right knee into Sukuna's face and pushed him away from Hana Angel before he could completely destroy his wings. Skidding, he launched a roundhouse kick, which Sukuna blocked by placing his arms in an X shape in front of his body, but he was knocked back a few inches. "I'll admit I like this new attitude, brat. But don't start a fight you can't win." He wiped his nose with a swipe of his forearm. He fixed his brown eyes on Sukuna's face and mocking smile. "I'm a Jujutsu sorcerer. And I plan to get my friend back." Chapter 14. Any sorcerer should have felt fear in the presence of the King of Curses, and even Sukuna himself had expected to see shock or desperation in the eyes of the boy who had been his vessel until that moment, especially when he had taken the body of his best friend to reincarnate. But Yuji Itadori not only did not remain still in fear, shock, or desperation, but he had taken a battle stance. It was all or nothing. The young pink-haired student was not showing a childish, happy look or one that showed terrifying fear. When Sukuna looked into the eyes of the 15-year-old sorcery student, he saw the eyes of a beast staring back at him, stalking him. And a shiver ran down his spine at that simple, harmless gesture from the one who had been his vessel, his jailer, the boy who brought him back to life. "This is ridiculous." Feeling intimidated by this bucking brat, Ryam and Sukuna smiled a hint of mockery and shrugged his shoulders to adjust his body. It had been a long time, 1,000 years, since he'd been alive again. Now he had a new body, a new chance to do whatever he wanted. And no one could stop him. Sukuna threw his body back and felt his body hit by the wind resulting from his opponent's circular movement. Yuji had launched a roundhouse kick that would have taken Sukuna's head off if he hadn't moved. And all of that happened in just a millisecond, in the blink of an eye. When did it move? He raised his arms and blocked the boy's descending punch, feeling the force of the blow make his arms shake, making them feel heavy as if they had gained a full ton, or as if he were holding weight so heavy they sent his limbs crashing to the ground. But he forced himself to raise his arms and block the pink-haired boy's reverse kick, trapping his leg. An opportunity that Yuji took advantage of to deliver a downward kick to Sukuna's shoulder and knock him down, making him fall to his right knee. The King of Curses' eyes widened in shock. He was kneeling in front of an ordinary human. Sukuna gritted his teeth and started to get up just in time to receive a knee that sent him crashing into the wall and covered in debris. Yuji clenched his fists and calmly began walking toward the hole in the building, remaining calm. Rocks flew at him and he sidestepped his body, dodging the projectiles. He raised his arms and covered his face, only to be pushed back by a direct punch from Sukuna, who glared maliciously at the younger sorcerer. "I'll admit you've got some guts," he muttered, wiping the blood from his split lip. Yuji stood about 10 meters away from where his opponent's punch had sent him flying. "To take me on, even if you're not special. You're just too insignificant in existence, Yuji Itadori. I'm not the one who has to steal bodies to revive and be able to fight with others." Yuji smirked, looking directly into Sukuna's narrowed eyes. "Without me or Megumi you would be nothing in this era. Your time has passed, old man." A straight jab lashed out at Yuji's face. He swung his arms and stepped to the side. Surprising Sukuna, Yuji Itadori wrapped his right arm around Sukuna and slammed the king into the ground in a headlock. He then unleashed a heel strike that cracked the hospital facade, causing a slight tremor. So many words to say nothing. Sukuna waved his hand. Yuji opened his eyes and in a flash, blood sprayed across his face, sending him stumbling back several steps. "You're nothing in this world, brat. You couldn't stop me in Shibuya and you won't be able to stop me now." Can your puny mind comprehend that? Drops of dark blood stained the ground. Slowly, the boy lifted his face, revealing the blood covering it, the absence of his right eye, which seemed to have been ruptured by Sukuna's cut, being the main cause of the bloodbath. You don't have a ritual, and you don't have the strength to stop me, kid. I'm still learning how to use this body. He flexed the fingers of both hands, clenching and unclenching them. Megumi Fushiguro was resisting being controlled, and he was holding him back just enough to keep from killing Yuji. To think you're equal to me would be nothing more than idiotic, brat. Taking advantage of the moment when Yuji was bleeding, Sukuna quickly stretched out his arm and pierced the boy's chest in a split second, causing Yuji to spit blood onto the King of Curses limb, who smiled cruelly upon seeing this. But that boy, Megumi, can't stop me from killing you. I guess this is goodbye, Yuji Itadori. Swiftly, Yuji's left fist slammed into Sukuna's face, enveloped in cursed energy. The divergent fist sent Sukuna crashing to the ground, causing him to spit out blood and fall some 20 meters, piercing through every floor of the hospital. After this, Yuji fell to his own knees, spitting out blood and feeling the pain of the tearing caused by Sukuna's stab. Shit. He left a hole in me. Sorcerers must be prepared for death. Fighting curses and witches isn't the easiest task in the world, and it's the one that keeps people in the world of the living. That's something Yuji Itadori already knew and had confirmed in Shibuya. And Professor Gojo had warned him that he would see death sooner rather than later. He gritted his teeth and struggled to stand. Slowly, the blood stopped and his body regained some strength. He let out the air he'd been holding in his lungs and took a step toward the hole just in time to jump and avoid a wall of ice that would have completely engulfed him. You. Sukuna's main servant appeared just as Yuji was about to chase after his enemy. He still intended to retrieve Megumi and stop Sukuna right there. I will not allow you to go after my lord, declared the white-haired boy with a strange reddish tinge surrounding his head from behind. I will stop you here. Yuji covered himself from the barrage of icy spikes the albino sent at him, feeling them digging into his body and making him grit his teeth. He hadn't prepared anything to stop the Iceman, nor had he waited for him to show up to back up Sukuna. In fact, he'd forgotten about him. Now, die here. The white-haired boy sent a massive tidal wave of ice crashing down on the wounded Yuji. The 15-year-old boy merely breathed and clenched his fists, enveloping them in cursed energy and preparing to strike the ice with a heavy blow. However, the ice shattered into 1,000 fragments, sending the Curse King's servant flying until he crashed to the ground. Sorry I'm late, Itadori. Scars marked Maki Zenin's body from when she was engulfed by Jogo's fire during the Shibuya Incident. That, along with the incident with the Zenin clan, had completely changed the sorceress, developing her character and her own strength to the point where she could handle situations like that. She was no longer the second-year Maki Zenin. She was the Maki Zenin who had survived a war and the one who killed her family. Maki-san. Maki grabbed Yuji by the hood and threw him back as she herself leaped to the right. A crest of ice attempted to impale the two sorcerers, but Maki's superior reflexes saved both boys from fatal injury. What happened to your eye? Sukuna cut him off. Yuji didn't say anything else about his right eye. The blood had stopped flowing, and the wound in his chest seemed to have closed on its own without any explanation. But the pain still registered in his body, and he had trouble staying fully upright. He was exhausted and hurt. As much as he tried to convince himself that he would be able to stop Sukuna, Yuji knew he couldn't. That stab wound in his body was what gave him the clear idea that they were in two completely different leagues. Where has Sukuna gone? There's a hole behind that ice. Yuji broke the ice shard stuck in him and nodded at Yuram's back. If we defeat him, we might be able to reach Sukuna and bring Megumi back by separating him from him. But the chances of him still being there are completely zero. Even I know Sukuna is gone, and this guy is just slowing us down. Maki stared at Yuram for several seconds, thinking about Yuji's words. They could defeat the white-haired man and go after Sukuna, but that would likely mean their deaths. They needed Professor Gojo to fight someone like Sukuna and stop Kenjaku. They didn't have the strength to defeat both of them. Maybe. If you don't move, I guess I'll have to make the decisive move. Icefall. Yuji and Maki braced themselves. Using his curse technique, Yuram molded the ice and sent a massive torrent crashing down on the two students, causing the hospital to collapse. Yuram was the only one left standing, atop a piece of the building that had withstood the fall. The man looked over the edge, looking down at the fragments of the hospital and the ice it had created. There was no way the students could have survived. Life, sometimes, breaks the impossible. Debris flew up, and the figures of Yuji and Maki became visible to Yuram, who pressed his lips together, making them a thin, almost imperceptible line. Had they survived without a scratch? That was completely absurd. I suppose I should go, he murmured, shaking his head. You've been saved, you two. But both Kenjaku and my lord, they're going to erase everything you know from history. The world as it is will be no more. Chapter 15. December 25th was the day in which Satoru Gojo and Sukuna would decide which of the two was the strongest, whether the strongest sorcerer of today or the strongest sorcerer in history, which could be a confrontation that would ultimately define which of the two sides would end up prevailing over the other, because both had their strongest sorcerers. The student team had a full month until December 25th to prepare for their confrontation with Sukuna and prepare for whatever plans Kenjaku himself had up his sleeve. Few of the sorcerers believed someone like Kenjaku would play fair in an honest confrontation. This was a war in the making, and even Yuji knew they had to give their all to recover Megumi and stop Kenjaku's plans, as he had likely already set some traps for them. Yuji Itadori had miraculously emerged almost unscathed from his first encounter with the King of Curses upon his return, suffering irreparable damage to his right eye, which had burst from one of the cuts caused by the curse. He also suffered various cuts across his body and was even pierced by one of his opponent's limbs. But all of that had disappeared, partially, thanks to the reverse curse technique, which regenerated any damage caused by Sukuna, or at least a less powerful version of it that allowed him to remain alive, albeit without one of his eyes. The socket of his eye was covered by the pink-haired teen with a dark eye patch that stood out on his slightly pale face. Although Satoru had pointed out that it made him look tough like a bad boy in a movie and that many girls would probably be after him. At these words, Yuji only gave a small, uneffusive smile, not feeling like a bad boy or anyone's interest. He had lost his two companions, he was completely alone in a war that would kill them all. At least, that was his thought, a dark negativity in contrast to the positivity of his teacher, who hadn't stopped smiling and laughing as he led him to one of the classrooms in the Kyoto school they were using as their base of operations. The rest of the sorcerers had already begun their training that morning, but Satoru had pulled him aside and asked him to join him in the afternoon to meet his mentor. Your training is going to be split in two. For the first half of the month, you're going to be in the care of a truly tough man. He's like a nearly mindless beast, and I was worried his son would be the same. I suppose he's decided to take your partner up on your offer to help you. That, and technically, he's doing it for his son, I suppose. Sensei? Satoru led young Yuji toward a pair of dark oak doors. When the albino-haired man pushed past them, Yuji's eyes took in the back of a truly strong man, almost muscle upon muscle, with a black t-shirt covering his torso, ready to explode. It would do so if the man made a single gesture that the t-shirt took as a threat to itself, which said a lot about the man standing there, only breathing. From a distance, the students saw the man's shoulders move. He was breathing calmly, but Yuji could sense the danger emanating from him, how he felt like running away simply from being in the same room with him, which made him wonder. Was that man human or a curse? Yuji wasn't sure if he wanted to find out what or who he was, or if he wanted him to turn around and look at him. Big guy. But Professor Gojo had a different idea, one very unlike Yuji's thoughts. As if he had known the man all his life and they had shared important moments, the albino man walked toward the muscular man with his left hand in his pants pocket and his right hand waving in greeting, which made the man twitch. Slowly, the muscular man turned and fixed his gaze on Professor Gojo. He had straight black hair, falling over his eyes and slightly covering them, the hair and shirt being just as black as his hair. A small scar adorned the right side of his mouth, from some cut or fight that would have marked him, because that scar wasn't a recent cut. Satoru. The man blinked and turned back to the two sorcerers. Yuji was surprised by how muscular the man looked, how tall he was, matching Professor Gojo's 6'6" frame. He also noticed how different the two adults were, like two sides of a coin, like the sun and the moon. Is that boy Yuji, the child I'm supposed to train? Yep. This is going to be your puppy for 2 weeks. I take it she's made all the arrangements, right? The man scratched the back of his neck lightly. Yeah. According to the voodoo brat, I have an estimated time of 16 days before I have to return to the other side. I guess I should entrust my boy to you and bring him back again. The man's dark eyes glittered brightly, and Satoru had the decency to look a little embarrassed by that. I've got the boy's entire syllabus memorized, so you don't have to worry. Maybe I'll send him back to you a little battered, but he's young. He'll sort himself out. That, or he'll awaken that technique you revived with. You still remember? If you hadn't awakened it, you would have died. When a sorcerer learns the reverse technique, they awaken a higher potential that few sorcerers can reach. It's like unlocking extra gears that fit together perfectly. That's why your control over your curse technique was greater the second time we met, despite your physical and mental exhaustion. That trick had worked out too well for you. Hahaha. I've got the script on my side, big guy. No wonder I could beat you, that I'm going to beat Sukuna and get your son back from his clutches. HMPF. You're too optimistic when you want to be, Satoru Gojo. The man's eyes moved towards the first-year student who felt drowned inside 2 enormous pits. I guess you don't know who I am. I've only had 2 surnames throughout my life. The one I was born with was that of the Zenin, one of the three great clans of sorcery, one with such an exorbitant ego that even Satoru Gojo seems like a charitable soul. He extended his arm towards the teenager. Yuji looked at that enormous hand and shook it, feeling the muscles of the stranger's arm almost crush his hand. Fushiguro was the surname I got when I married the best woman I could find, the only person who was my hope. I guess Megumi didn't tell you about her disgusting father because he wasn't a real example. Although the boy has brought out some things in me that we could try to fix once you get him out of where he's been. Megumi's father's eyes turned slightly steely, like two blades. Call me Toji if it's alright with you, Yuji. I'll be your trainer, the person who's going to shape your body into a weapon for your battle with Sukuna. Toji then flashed a smile that chilled Yuji's blood. It was only a small gesture, but the feeling of certain death washed over him and left him frozen for a few seconds due to surprise, not expecting that from someone human. Although Yuji could tell right away, after only a few minutes, that Toji wasn't someone normal at all and was better seen as a human monster and not an ordinary human. Yes, on pleasure, Toji-sensei. Haha, thanks for the sensei, kid. He crossed his arms over his body, highlighting his pecs and biceps, which swelled and caused the sleeves of his t-shirt to become too tight. But that's not going to save you from the suffering I have in store for you. To forge diamonds, you have to put all the pressure you can into them. And I'm good at putting pressure. I don't think you'll hesitate for long, big guy. Stop calling me that, Toji tried to grab Satoru's head, but his hand hovered several inches from the sorcerer's face, which resulted in a grunt from the dark-haired man. You're as annoying as a pain in the ass, Satoru. And you can't break me. HMPH. The two adults stared at each other for a few more seconds before looking away. Satoru looked to the right and Toji looked to the left, his arm no longer extended. In Yuji's eyes, the two men got along better than they seemed at first glance, or at least it was his sad perception of that interaction. Wait. As if a thought had finally occurred to the young man, Yuji Itadori looked at the two men with a certain degree of confusion that they understood. How did you revive? I mean, who did it? I know from Megumi that you're dead, and if you're here, it means someone. That someone would be me, pink idiot who can't live without me because I'd end up dead. Yuji's head whipped around as the female voice broke the faint silence that had formed between the three men. There she was, standing at the entrance to the room, wearing a matching eye patch on the left side, covering the wound caused by Mahito's touch during the Shibuya incident. There stood Nobara Kujisaki, wearing the same sorceress uniform he'd last seen her in, flashing that confident smile, the eye patch covering her left eye socket particularly striking. But Yuji wasn't grinning broadly. His lips tried to curl into a smile that showed his own joy, but it only cracked and tears flowed as he trembled, taking one step after another toward the red-haired girl. It was Nobara who finally hugged Yuji, covering the distance between them in an instant. There, crybaby, she patted the pink-haired boy on the back and flashed a smirk as he wrapped her in a hug that could have split a tree. Nobara felt the sadness in the gesture, the dents in her companion's constant cheerfulness. Guess we're supposed to save Megumi's ass, huh? You and me, both one-eyed and broken. I guess that idiot couldn't have refused to be a demon's doll. Off to the side, the two adults watched the interaction. Toji didn't show much emotion beyond a brief smile. But Satoru was a little more effusive, with a few tears falling from his eyes and a handkerchief in his right hand. They were the future of witchcraft. Chapter 16. Two figures moved within the training room. The larger, taller man outpaced the smaller man's reaction speed, intercepting her every move, every attempt to strike or subdue him. Taking advantage of his own physical superiority, the man landed just enough blows to overload the younger man's defenses, rendering the boy's dominant arm useless, dangling at his side. He was forced to rely solely on his opposite arm to defend and attack, thus reducing his chances of surviving the onslaught of blows from the adult man, who didn't slow down or intensify with each blow directed at the teenager's body. But the boy wasn't about to give up as long as he could remain standing and continue fighting, something that drew a sinister smile from his mentor as he saw those brown eyes shining with the intensity of a predator. Toji Fushiguro, formerly Zenin, was one of the people who was marked with a heavenly restriction, preventing him from using cursed energy, he didn't have one, and from seeing curses, but giving him overwhelming physical power that he learned to use at his own convenience, turning his body into a lethal weapon with each of the martial arts he learned, which he refined, thus giving him the title of Sorcerer Slayer. One of the few men or women in the world of sorcery with the ability to defeat a sorcerer or a curse with their bare hands, with their own overwhelming strength. And, unlike others marked with that restriction, Toji saw it as a plus, as a true test and a wall to overcome. Seeing it that way made him evolve and become the best without cursed energy, being the only one who left his family alive by a simple whim of fate. Choosing Satoru as Yuji's mentor had been the most correct one for the teenager. According to studies and research, Yuji could have been marked with a heavenly restriction like Maki and Toji, being the reason why he did not awaken his mother's ritual, and why he could not use cursed energy or see curses before being Sukuna's vessel, although he could perceive the latter, as demonstrated in the incident at his school. Having eaten Sukuna's finger gave Yuji the way to use the cursed energy, awakening it within him and giving him one more weapon for his body, which kept evolving constantly after the awakening he had after his confrontation against Maldito in Shibuya, which turned him into a predator in the eyes of Toji and others like him. In Toji's words, Yuji Itadori was the perfect sorcerer. He had a perfect physique and the cursed energy to complement it. His constant evolution made the boy's final form and power unpredictable, which could turn him into someone with a natural talent to be a beast willing to destroy his enemies. If anyone could defeat Sukuna, Toji had no doubt it would be the boy in front of him, with those predatory eyes looking at him as if he were the prey, despite the fact that he was missing an arm and his face destroyed by the constant blows from him. Toji Fushiguro twisted his lips and showed his trademark smile. If the boy were a cursor and ordinary sorcerer, he would have killed him already. He didn't possess a ritual like Satoru's, which put him in an exalted position. He didn't have a life script to survive. Yuji Itadori had gotten this far with only his fists, his tireless will, and his own desire to keep the people he cared about alive, following his grandfather's words. He didn't even seem to care that his mother had been Kenjaku and all that entailed, being conceived only to be a vessel. And that made Toji respect the young man far more than anyone else who was planning to fight Kenjaku or Sukuna, and he was willing to leave his son's safety in the boy's hands. Letting out a sigh that reached Yuji's ears, Toji lowered his arms, his fists showing Yuji's blood running down his knuckles, and abandoned the fighting stance he had been in until now, giving the boy a look of respect for a few seconds before making that glow disappear, and his eyes returned to those of the sorcerer slayer, the despicable Toji Fushiguro who almost destroyed his own clan. There's still a long way to go for you, his mouth moved on its own. Continuing to beat your face and body like a punching bag isn't going to improve your physical condition. You could take a break and we'll continue in a bit. Or get that woman who smokes non-stop to cure you so you can continue. In that second of rest, Yuji allowed himself to lower his left arm, his forearm, looked slightly swollen and let out a sigh of satisfaction and pain as he felt the wounds now come to life, throbbing beneath his clothes, reminding him that they were there and wouldn't let him rest. But he soon closed his eyes and took a deep breath, filling his lungs with air. Only the best sorcerers could achieve what he was doing, but if he wanted to fight Sukuna on the same level and get Megumi out of this mess, he had to be able to perform the reverse ritual without difficulty and whenever he needed to, which would probably be throughout the entire fight. The wounds began to heal under Toji's watchful eye, who whistled as he watched the reverse curse technique take effect on the body of someone as young as Yuji, who didn't seem surprised by his own abilities. In fact, when he opened his eyes and looked at Toji, the man felt the eyes of a wolf upon him, its jaws wide open. Yuji raised his right arm, which had been useless, and demonstrated to his mentor that he could move it without any difficulty, showing the man that he had regained full mobility and that his injuries were a thing of the past. "Ha! I see you've learned something useful, lad." Toji returned to his fighting stance. "You're now going to be my personal punching bag, and I'm sorry for that." But Yuji had disappeared. Following his own muscles' instincts, Toji crossed his arms in an X shape in front of his torso, only to feel a powerful direct blow seconds later that nearly made him lean forward. Shifting his body, Toji dodged Yuji's knee and was able to get away from the boy by jumping back about 2 meters, gaining distance. "Faster? Has it gotten faster?" Toji Fushiguro didn't take that as a mockery or as dire news. Yuji Itadori was growing under his training, under his eyes, with his foot placed on his neck. In war, you either adapted and became stronger, or you ran away and were devoured by crows days later. And Yuji was making the first choice presented to him, which made him smile as he looked at the boy, who was already coming for him with a divergent fist, ready to be launched. But he reacted to the blow by letting it pass, and with it the second, delayed blow, entering Yuji's zone. He moved his hand, cupped his face with his right hand, and with his left fist, punched the teenager's right abdomen, earning a grunt from him and causing him to thrash against him, catching himself in some kind of lock that sought to suffocate him. "It might work in combat, but we're sorcerers, Yuji Itadori." Toji wrapped his arms around Yuji's waist, squeezing it with the strength of a bear, and without any fear, performed a suplex with the teenager, slamming him into the ground, causing the platform to creak under the impact and drops of blood to fly towards the man's face. Yuji slowly stood up. Blood trickled from his right temple, but his eyes were completely fixed on Toji Fushiguro's figure and didn't leave it even when the man launched himself at him at top speed. This, of course, caught Toji off guard, generating genuine surprise. When he went to punch the boy, Yuji only reacted by catching the adult's fist with his right elbow and knees, assuming a kung fu stance that brought a mocking smile to the man's face. "That is? The teenager reacted by hitting Toji's chest with his left fist, causing the man to be thrown back several meters, leaving a trail of dust in the man's feet as he was pushed by an excessive force, but nothing he couldn't handle. The young man's reaction was completely natural, driven by simple instinct, as if he weren't thinking about anything, and his muscles were moving on their own, his body controlled by invisible threads. That was a big hit. Toji massaged the area affected by Yuji's blow, probably with some broken bones. Yuji Itadori, the strange boy who was used as a vessel for a demon moving his arms, Toji blocked the teenager's leg, causing a wind wave after the contact between his right forearm and the student's left leg. "You're the boy I want to train." Right jab. Left jab again. Right counterattack. Student and teacher moved, throwing punches, defending each attack and counterattacking without fear of killing their opponent, constantly moving around the stage without worrying about damage. The wind stirred. Left and right fists connected, bringing the two face to face, staring into each other's eyes, air rushing from their half-open mouths. They separated and jumped back, distancing themselves, leaving about 4 meters between them and neutral territory. Yuji fell to his right knee, his eyes wider than usual, sweat dripping from his face. Using the reverse curse technique without being accustomed to it is a problem in an initial fight. Let's try to get your body used to it so your mind can understand the pain afterward, the loss of energy. He crossed his arms over his torso, smiling mockingly. Satoru Gojo is a bad teacher. I had to come here to turn you into the beast you are, Yuji Itadori. Toji Fushiguro was certain he could transform Yuji Itadori into a true beast, a sorcerer who wouldn't need to rely on anyone, the trump card of a society doomed to destruction. His intentions were to turn Yuji back into the beast he once was. Chapter 17. Curse techniques or rituals were awakened by those sorcerers who had cursed energy and could vary in type and scope, becoming more or less powerful, although much of their power came from the handling of the sorcerer who used it. Many of these techniques had become a line for the sorcerer families of Japan, being a representation of their power or status, becoming the reason in some of the sorcerer clans, the reason for the election of a leader, as was the case of the Zenin clan with the Ten Shadows technique, the strongest technique within the clan, and which put, at the time, Megumi as its leader, according to the rules of the same clan. But having a curse technique within the family, although in many cases there were several techniques in the same clan, since it was not something that was inherited through blood, did not ensure that all members would awaken a ritual or possess cursed energy, as was the case with Toji Fushiguro or Maki Zenin, who were bound by a celestial restriction that prevented them from possessing cursed energy, but giving them enormous physical abilities balancing the scales. Physically surpassing many who had cursed energy. However, above all the techniques and all the sorcerers in history, the most powerful ritual was the of the Gojo clan, turning whoever awakened it into an extremely strong sorcerer. Although this technique had to be complemented with the 6 eyes to increase its control and precision in order to wield the full power of the technique. In the current era, Satoru Gojo had taken on the role of the strongest sorcerer, balancing the balance between curses and sorcerers thanks to his immense power. He was the last of his clan's members, but he possessed both the 6 eyes and the unlimited curse technique, and after improving and learning them, Satoru had made a huge difference in the confrontations between sorcerers and curses. He had been one of the sorcerers that Kenjaku saw as a threat. "Why did you tell me all about your curse technique, Professor?" Yuji and Satoru were currently in the same room Toji had used for the first-year students' physical training. The time allowed for the man to be kept alive by Nobara's technique had passed, so the first part of Yuji's training had concluded a few hours ago, and now Satoru Gojo had taken over from the man he had killed in a fight. Satoru stared at his student for a long moment. Why was he teaching Yuji all about his curse technique? Why had he told him about the 6 eyes and the unlimited curse technique if he wasn't part of his clan? Yuji Itadori had been Sukuna's vessel until 2 weeks ago, when the King of Curses himself had taken over Megumi Fushiguro's body, turning himself into a cursed object. That, of course, had left Yuji without his primary weapon in case of mortal danger, but it hadn't left him completely unarmed. After learning his student's story, Satoru thought long and hard about what Yuji Itadori meant to Kenjaku and the wider world of sorcery. Was he an ordinary young man? No. Was he a sorcerer? Not until he became involved with one of Sukuna's fingers and became its vessel. But the boy's sorcerer background was in the boy's DNA, it was present. His mother had been a sorceress controlled by Kenjaku. The boy had been born in a strange way, being itself a cursed womb, a vessel created to contain Ryam and Sukuna and contain the full power of the 20 fingers. And yet, the boy was born with a heavenly restriction. Yuji's birth had been strange and planned by Kenjaku to further his own agenda. He was the descendant of Akemo, indirectly, and Yuji's mother, or mother's body, had been a former sorceress, whose curse had been taken by Kenjaku when he inhabited her body to create his vessel. Yuji would have been a sorcerer if things had followed their natural course. Satoru saw the same pattern that affected Maki and Kokichi Muta, and there was no doubt that Yuji had a heavenly restriction that prevented him from using cursed energy or acquiring his mother's technique. But there was a distinction between the three. People with a heavenly restriction couldn't use cursed energy, much less see curses, something Yuji could do, which was the reason he was turned into a sorcerer. He may have been able to sense curses before, but since becoming Sukuna's vessel, the boy had been able to see them and confront them by wielding his own cursed energy. Becoming Ryam and Sukuna's vessel had made him an exception to the rule. He possessed all the qualities of a person with a heavenly restriction, he could wield cursed energy to fight. And he could see through curses without any artifacts. To Satoru, his first-year student was a complete exception who wouldn't pass away for another 1,000 years. You must understand everything that my curse technique is because it is part of my plan to defeat Ryam and Sukuna and bring Megumi back to life. Satoru had two scenarios in mind. The first was the most complicated. He defeated Sukuna but in the process killed Megumi, something he wasn't putting on the table for sure. He preferred to rescue his student rather than wipe him off the face of the earth, which was much more dangerous for everyone. The second showed him being defeated by Sukuna and leaving things in the hands of the other sorcerers, not all of whom were too trustworthy to fight a monster from 1,000 years ago. And, at that point, came the boy standing in front of him, looking at him with his one good eye. Me? What would it benefit me to know your curse technique, Professor? Sukuna can't use it. But you can emulate her. The man let out a deep sigh. Sukuna had taken Megumi's body for one thing only. His curse technique, the one that could defeat him. Sukuna has taken Megumi's body so he could summon the divine general of the 8 divergent leaves of Sila. Mahoraga, a Shikigami that Megumi can summon and that can overcome my curse technique, therefore, he can kill me if the fight goes too far. I don't understand how that would help me emulate your technique, Professor. Yuji looked at Satoru with real confusion. I don't have a technique like Yuta-senpai, so I can't summon your own technique to fight them, Professor. If Mahoraga beats you, why would I be able to face him? Do you remember when I trained you by watching movies? Aha. There you still had Sukuna inside your body. You were the vessel of Sukuna, the container of a monster that is now unleashed. The albino's blue eyes bored into his student. They were blue eyes like the sky, as bright as 2 clear sapphires. You couldn't summon Sukuna at will, nor could you use his techniques at will. But that doesn't mean you couldn't use them in the long run. Yuji had eaten some of the most dangerous cursed objects in the world of magecraft, thus causing his body to have 2 souls, each with its own mind. But just as Sukuna planned to use Megumi's power, Yuji could use Sukuna's power to confront him, each of his techniques, and that was because of the residue that Sukuna himself left inside his previous vessel and chose not to get rid of it. Sukuna plans to use Megumi's curse technique to kill me. But you can do the same. You've been Sukuna's vessel for several months. You've trained in the control and handling of cursed energy. You are a cursed womb created for the plans of a madman. And you have been cursed with a restriction that gave you a powerful body and that you yourself have broken with the help of Sukuna, who gave you access to the cursed energy by being in your body. That. Right now, after me and Okkotsu, you are our third weapon in the battle against Sukuna and Kenjaku. You are, with proper training, a sorcerer who will stand a chance against the High-Era monster who has brought so much suffering. Professor Gojo's hands fell on the student's shoulders, gaining the teen's full attention. Yuji Itadori. From this moment on, you are a special grade sorcerer. Having carried Sukuna makes you feel the edge between souls. Yuji Itadori blinked, feeling the weight of his teacher's hands on his shoulders. The importance of those words spoken by Satoru sank into his mind like a nail hammered down with the intention of staying, like a hot iron stuck to his skin. But I'm going to give you the tools you need, Yuji. That's why I had you train with Megumi's crazy old father. Satoru Gojo's smile widened. I have a plan that only you can execute. Chapter 18. Ryam and Sukuna had been defeated 1,000 years ago, during the golden age of curses and sorcerers, when people still believed in monsters, gods, and heroes who gave their lives for humanity. Nowadays, over the years, sorcerers had abandoned all hope for a new golden age, a time when sorcerers would once again be the pillar of the world and the hope of those who hid from the darkness. The sacrifice game had shown that humanity viewed sorcerers as tools or that they couldn't believe that magic existed. The modern era was an era where sorcerers hadn't even managed to awaken their domain expansions. Compared to the sorcerers of 1,000 years ago, modern sorcerers were on a much lower scale of power than today, with those reincarnated by Kenjaku possibly being placed 1 or 2 steps above modern sorcerers. Although there were exceptions. Hiromi Higuruma had finished sealing his pact with Yuji Itadori and had joined the sorcerers' side in their war against Sukuna and Kenjaku, the main leaders of the enemy group of the darkness that moved over the world. For a sorcerer of the modern age, Hiromi had proven to be on a level comparable to Satoru Gojo, becoming, due to his mastery, an ace up the sleeve of the group of sorcerers, led by Professor Gojo. But since Satoru had mentioned his student, he had a plan. Yuji Itadori had been the vessel of the Curse King for a period of 3 months before the war, harvesting residual parts of the cursed energy from the monster now ravaging the world. For Satoru, Yuji was the perfect tool to fight Sukuna and get Megumi back, as the first year was aware of soul edges from having housed Sukuna within him for an extended period, giving Yuji perfect perception between souls and seeing their edges. Yuji was willing to learn everything about souls, so he accepted the book of the late Yuki Tsukumo and had studied it at the same time he studied the Gojo clan manuscripts on the Infinity and the Six Eyes, which gave him heavy reading to pass the hours when he wasn't exercising his body, because despite having finished training with Megumi's father, the boy continued to perform the exercises as a way of recording them in his body, passing the information from his head to his muscles. Thus taking advantage of his physical qualities placed above average, perhaps equaling those of Maki. The current plan on the table was simple for the sorcerers. Satoru would open the war against Sukuna and Kenjaku's team with his initial fight against the King of Curses, which would result in the strongest in history at the end of the fight, something that worried more than one of the sorcery students. If Satoru died, who would fight Sukuna? The physical and mental exhaustion resulting from the confrontation was a card to be taken into account in the continuation of the fight. Satoru was unaware of his rival's abilities, but Sukuna had learned everything about his curse technique and had observed it in action from within his first-year student. He knew about red and blue, but he didn't know about purple. Although the barrier he had placed on himself could be overcome with simple mastery with the appropriate characteristics, something Sukuna was familiar with. On the other hand, he was unaware of Sukuna's abilities and had only seen his cut in action on more than one occasion. But if he thought about it carefully and aligned the time Sukuna had lived, the king must have had an enormous arsenal of hidden techniques and tools to use, as well as hide his true power. It was this last part that had led Satoru to prepare backup plans in case he died. Of the two enemies, Sukuna was the harder to read, the more complicated to eliminate from the equation, and the one whose strengths were largely unknown. He was, in and of himself, the primary objective of the mission, but they couldn't kill him because he possessed Megumi's body, and surprisingly, he wasn't willing to sacrifice his student and kill him alongside Sukuna, which would likely lead to his death. Then there came his two students, or rather, the 4-star students. Maki and Yuta were going to enter the fight when things went wrong, but they had their attention focused solely on Kenjaku and stopping whatever his plan was. On the other hand, Yuji and Nobara would be solely focused on Sukuna and Yuram respectively, which said a lot about the two first-year teenagers, because although Kinji Hakari had shown interest in the Curse King's aid, just like Kashimo, he seemed to want to face Sukuna alone. Something that Yuji himself was willing to do following the plans on the table. And the day the fight began was tomorrow. Yuji had spent the entire month preparing for the upcoming match. He had consumed his siblings, at Joso's request, so he could obtain blood manipulation as a technique to fall back on. He had also learned everything he could from the book Yuki had written, learning everything he could about souls, which would give him the idea of how to undo the bond between Sukuna and Megumi, something he could only do with his own punches, which had increased in power after training with Toji and his own subsequent exercises, learning more about how to handle cursed energy and physical blows themselves. I could tell he was nervous. 13 hours before the start of the fight, the boy's hands were trembling on his legs, his eyes fixed only on the moon above the city of Tokyo. A city that had been completely deserted, at the mercy of curses and the renegade sorcerers in Kenjaku's service, who seemed to have disappeared as well, as if someone had frightened them with their presence. Yuji could tell Professor Gojo was his ace in the hole in that fight, his weapon to defeat Sukuna. But a strange gnawing had been bothering him for hours. Something was going to go wrong. They weren't taking into account Sukuna's skills, the tools he would use to defeat Satoru, and have his own fun in a prolonged confrontation. It seemed the professor had had the same thought. That's why he'd suggested that. Here you are, crybaby. Slowly, Nobara sat down next to her teammate, just to his right. Both teenagers had come to the rooftop with the same intention, or so Yuji thought, as he went up to calm his thoughts and nerves. Tomorrow's the day. Fushiguro's giving us too much trouble, and I hope he apologizes when you get him out of the mess he's gotten himself into. You're going to have to give him a good beating from me. Nobara's voice was mocking, full of the optimism the other sorcerers were currently lacking. Yuji must have admired that about his partner. She didn't seem inclined to run away like many others, and after having gotten out of a life-or-death situation, she was willing to fight in a war where she could die. Wasn't she nervous about that? His partner had a mental strength he admired. I guess I can give him a few good hits. Nobara twisted her lips into a smile at Yuji's words, looking directly up at the moon again. She had been staring at Yuji with her one good eye until she got the answer, a gesture the boy hadn't noticed or seen. He deserves it for worrying us, for letting a madman take over his body, Yuji sighed. And that demon, he made a pact, didn't he? To bring you back to life, and you didn't remember it. Yuji nodded at his companion's words. He had made a pact with Sukuna to return to life. A pact that cost him Megumi's life in a certain way. Because of that pact, Sukuna had possessed his companion without him being able to do anything, without him being able to stop him, because he didn't break the pact they made about not harming their companions. He had found a loophole. That was why Yuji was willing to fight Sukuna. He was willing to follow his teacher's rules in order to achieve a resounding victory over his enemy and rescue his teammate. Suddenly, he felt a warmth hit his lips. He blinked, feeling a light caress run down his right cheek. When he focused, he saw Nobara's face just inches from his, looking up at him with a small smile, a faint blush on her cheeks. "We're probably going to die tomorrow," Yuji blinked as he felt a kiss on his neck now. "And there's a high chance we'll never see each other again. One of the four of us is going to die. I feel it in my soul." She placed her hands on Yuji's chest, making him look down slightly at his partner's hands. "Please, Yuji. Stop thinking about Sukuna for a moment, about how nervous you feel about Megumi's life." She cupped Yuji's face again and gave him a second kiss. "Tonight just think about being a normal teenager. Just 13 hours. After tomorrow we'll know what to do with this." Wizards signed for their deaths and few saw a future as adults. Only the best wizards could live a full, adult life, like Principal Gakuganji or Professor Gojo. But teenagers like them could die the next day. Yuji held Nobara's waist firmly. He never thought about relationships, kisses, or a normal school life or that of an average teenager. His mind was always on his grandfather. Would a little bit of normal life before war be wrong? Without further ado, Yuji Itadori returned the kiss. Chapter 19. The sorcerer's eyes were on the figure of Satoru Gojo, the strongest sorcerer currently in existence. The 29-year-old man had changed his attire, taking on white pants with wide legs and a dark t-shirt clinging to his torso, which highlighted his firm muscles from constant training, making him a somewhat provocative sight, since Satoru was not an ugly man and his body had been shaped by training from a rather early age. Facing the sorcerer stood the man who had changed the course of events after 1,000 years. Dressed similarly to his adversary, but with lighter colored clothing, Ryam and Sukuna exuded the confidence that came from knowing his own abilities and his time planning this plan, which seemed to be coming to fruition after 1,000 years, taking the body of a 15-year-old boy. Both men were the embodiment of the past and the present, two pillars with a strong foundation that had allowed them to grow to an immovable point. And today they were just minutes away from deciding which of the two was the strongest, which would remain alive while the other was sent to the other side, their last breath escaping their lips. And it seemed like Satoru's confidence was sky high. The Gojo clan didn't have many enemies that could overcome their curse technique, much less when it was linked to the Six Eyes, which gave the Gojo a tremendous power, making them the key to the balance between curses and sorcerers, being a constant focus of the latter's presence for the former, being the figure that engendered fear in the cursed presences of curses. However, Ryam and Sukuna had been alive for 1,000 years, born in an era where sorcerers died and found their own walls. An era where curse techniques were undeveloped and foundations were being built slowly. And this gave Sukuna the knowledge to fight any enemy, including a member of the Gojo clan. Ryam and Sukuna had regained the power of the 20 fingers by devouring what remained of his corpse, which could have become a cursed object that radiated his former essence, as if his soul were still bound to the rotten bones of his skeleton, joining together after a long period. Despite that, Sukuna still knew that he couldn't fight Satoru for an undeniable fact. He didn't have, among his abilities, one with which to overcome his enemy, one with which to surpass the infinity of the special grade sorcerer who stood in front of him, looking at him with blue eyes. And that's where Megumi Fushiguro's body came in. I guess Sukuna took the boy's body for something special, right? The gathered sorcerers from both Kyoto and Tokyo were watching the battle between the two current monsters, praying for Satoru's victory. If I had to say something, Hiromi rested her chin on her hands, looking with her dark eyes at the strange roulette wheel on Sukuna's back, which had spun slowly. I would say it's because of the boy's curse technique. That's his weapon against Satoru Gojo. If not, why would he have taken the boy's body? You should add that Itadori never let Sukuna control him. His mental strength is superior, if I may add. The adult's eyes shifted to Yuji Itadori. The first-year student sat meditating, his legs crossed in the lotus flower pose, his hands resting in his lap, his one good eye completely closed, the other hidden by a dark blindfold. That's right. Yu-chan was the vessel before Megumi was possessed, Kurara murmured, blinking. Along with Kinji, he had met Yuji when he still had Sukuna inside him, so the demon's body switch seemed strange to them. If Sukuna hadn't controlled him until then, he wouldn't have done it now. Sukuna switched bodies to obtain Megumi's technique. It was completely undeniable. However, Yuji's will could have been another factor in the change. The 15-year-old boy had kept the King of Curses under control for 2 months, not allowing him to manifest unless something forced him to do so, such as swallowing several fingers at once or entering the world of sorcery without the proper weapons. We have to assume Kenjaku has something hidden. Kinji drew attention to himself. We mustn't forget about the scarred man for any reason. Our eyes are only on these 2 monsters. What is that bastard who started all this doing then? He's probably waiting for the best moment to strike. Yuta's eyes darkened at the mention of Kenjaku. He had been the one in charge of killing Suguru Geto a year ago, thus causing Kenjaku's plans to begin in some strange way after occupying the deceased sorcerer's body. He felt guilty about Kenjaku's presence because he had obtained Tenjin and his plans were following his wishes. He's a man with a plan. He's not going to take any chances. He'll be following his own plans to the letter and he'll have some trump cards. Yuta was certain of his own words. Kenjaku would be on the other side of the city, watching the opening moments of the historic battle unfold. But he wouldn't be idle like them, waiting for a verdict. Kenjaku would be making his own plans, moving the pieces on the board between them, observing his enemies and allies for a guaranteed victory. However, we have other cards up our sleeve. He clutched the katana to his chest as he watched Sukuna's Shikigami surround Professor Gojo, pressuring him and keeping the king alive after receiving a purple directly against his face. We can assume Sukuna knows about the plans, Hiromi commented. He might have even been split into 20 fingers before. It was probably Kenjaku who helped him become a cursed object. Kenjaku is a wise man in a way. Kashimo frowned. The High-Era sorcerer had joined the group of sorcerers with the sole intention of facing Sukuna in a fight to the death. If Satoru lost, he'd taken second place to fight the King of Curses and he fully intended to do so, something none of the sorcerers had objected to or seemed willing to oppose. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd helped Sukuna stay alive up until this exact moment in history. To him, he's his most powerful ally. Sukuna is Kenjaku's trump card. Otherwise, he wouldn't have created my little brother. Toso crossed his arms over his chest as he watched Satoru's movements against his 3 rivals. The teacher's attention was focused solely on Sukuna, his primary objective being to defeat or weaken him. If Satoru didn't defeat him, they would have to face a worn-out Sukuna, which would make it much easier for them to defeat him once and for all. Itadori was Ryaman's vessel by the convenience of fate itself, which has been a bit disastrous for all of us. Gakuganji took a deep breath, seeing how Sukuna was knocked down, missing a hand and blood dripping onto the ground. That has led us to the present moment. Unfortunately, we old people have been too blind to be able to see reality after 1,000 years. The elders had been murdered, likely by Kenjaku or someone else affiliated with the cursed sorcerers group. Gakuganji, the headmaster of Kyoto, was the only council member still alive, even after killing Yaga, something that could have incurred Satoru's hatred. But there he was, watching the world change, playing a key role in bringing about that moment. We're not getting anywhere by talking. We must stick to the plan. Hiromi stood up at the same time as Kashimo. Ryam and Sukuna will be the target to defeat. Yuji slowly opened his one good eye as he sensed the change on the battlefield. The air left his mouth slowly in a deep breath, letting all the nerves escape from his body with that simple gesture. Swallowing hard, the boy began to stand up at the same time Kashimo jumped out the window. Itadori-san. The boy glanced briefly at the lawyer. Originally, they were going to be the ones in charge of the 3rd round against Sukuna. But the teenager changed his mind when he saw Satoru's body split in 2. Without saying anything, he leaped toward the battlefield. That idiot. The Kyoto principal growled at the young sorcerer's move. What's he doing jumping behind Kashimo? Does he intend to fight Sukuna? My junior's decisions can be a bit too abrupt. Yuta placed the katana hanging on his back. He gripped the strap tightly and adjusted it, glancing at Maki. It's time to do our part. You don't seem upset about your teacher's death and Itadori's insubordination. I'm sorry if we seem cold to you. Maki Zenin fixed her eyes on the lawyer. Your expansion and technique may be useful to us in finishing off Sukuna. Stay tuned. That's Yuji's decision, for some reason unknown to us. I guess the dead have one last wish. And you? He's taking care of you, Rom. Well, it's time to move. Satoru Gojo, the hope of humanity, has died. Chapter 20. Shinjuku had previously been one of Tokyo's most important neighborhoods, attracting a significant number of tourists due to its appearance in various films and animated series. Currently, the neighborhood was uninhabited, in ruins, with lifeless bodies left behind by clashes between sorcerers and curses, giving the place a completely sad image. This allowed both sides, sorcerers and curses, to use Shinjuku as their favorite location for a confrontation between the 2 strongest members of each group. With the fall of one of them, this had turned into a war against the current strongest being, who had transformed his body into a stronger, more primitive version of his own being. Sukuna's arms were transformed into 4 strong limbs, with 2 perfect replicas of the first 2 limbs. The right side of his face became a strange, hardened mask-like shape covering the right side of his face, leaving 2 eyes visible to anyone who looked at it. At first glance, with 4 arms, 2 mouths, and a deformed face, Ryuman Sukuna was the very image of a monster, a demon who had managed to control a body, despite his enemies' attempts to stop him. But in Kishima's eyes, Sukuna's body, which was a combination of his old self and his new one, was perfect. The mouth that formed in Sukuna's stomach allowed the King of Curses to form chants without much concentration, allowing him to manipulate his techniques to a level never before seen by a sorcerer in the modern era. And having 4 arms gave him the advantage of forming signs, even when his hands were busy fighting an opponent. The king's demonic body had many advantages in the eyes of the High-era sorcerer. So many that he was captivated by the sight of Sukuna during their confrontation. Dust disappears. Extending his upper left arm, Sukuna shoved Kishima with an invisible force, destabilizing the distracted sorcerer. By the time he tried to recover, it was too late. A massive mesh of cuts was advancing inexorably toward him. Dozens of cuts like the one that killed Satoru Gojo. There was nothing he could do. Kishima had wanted to fight Sukuna. That was his condition for joining the sorcerer's side in their quest to stop Kenjaku and the King of Curses, which had forced them to agree to Kishima's fight against Sukuna after Satoru's fight with him. That's why no one jumped to Kishima's defense or tried to save him. It was a war, and wars produced casualties on the opposing sides. I guess you've finally taken control of your destiny, brat. The King of Curses' eyes shifted toward the cloud of dust and debris, scanning it for cover as he sensed the presence of his former vessel. Walking slowly, his brown eye glancing at the demon that had taken over his friend's body, Yuji Itadori stepped out of the cloud of dust, as if his good eye hadn't witnessed the deaths of his mentor and Kishima within the span of an hour. As if he wasn't aware of how dangerous Sukuna was. I can say with all words that you are now even uglier than before. He adjusted the sleeves of his uniform jacket as he stopped about 15 meters from Sukuna, delivering that indirect insult as if it were only a simple caress. 4 eyes. 4 arms. 2 mouths. Why not 4 legs too? Slowly, Yuji looked at Sukuna. His face was impassive at the teenager's words. He didn't care about the desperate teenage mockery or taunts. So he simply curled his lips and glared smugly at the boy who had been his container. What does it feel like to see people die, to lose your best friend, your siblings, your grandfather, and not be able to do anything about it? The boy's right arm moved at breakneck speed. He closed the distance in the blink of an eye, far exceeding the speed of a normal human. And, after that blink, a crashing sound and then a ripple of wind kicked up the dust in the battle zone. Oh, did it hurt? Yuji took a deep breath. His right fist had been stopped by his opponent's left hand, as if it had the strength of a mere human teenager. But he wasn't human. And yet, Sukuna smirked. However, the king felt the pressure on his shoulders. It was only for a millisecond. It was the weight of the world on his shoulders that made him tremble, and in a second, he saw Yuji's knee approaching his face. He couldn't avoid it, and the boy hit him, sending him tumbling backward. NGH. You're making fun of the person who's going to kill you. He relaxed his posture and squared his shoulders, straightening his back in the process. He stamped his legs with both hands, shaking off his nerves, and stared directly at Sukuna. And I'm not the kind of person who forgives a mistake. Both moved at tremendous speed. The blows followed one another in a split second, leaving many unable to see the decisive blow. But when Sukuna and Yuji separated, the blood on the king's chin was an indicator of what had happened in that small exchange, as were the teenager's shattered knuckles. You son of a bitch, brat, Sukuna spat directly at the teen's feet. Using his upper right hand, the curse wiped the blood from his chin without noticing it. What exactly are you? But there was no response other than a direct jab, forcing him to cover the area where his lower mouth was with 3 of his arms. Still, Yuji's superhuman strength pushed him back. Ryuman Sukuna wasn't one to contradict himself, apologize, or accept a mistake he'd made himself. But that eye staring at him, that sense of death that nodded at him on the hospital rooftop, was slowly making him reconsider. What was the brat? Why did he see him as a threat when he didn't even have a curse technique beyond his superhuman strength? When he felt Yuji's leg hit his right shoulder and make him stumble until he fell on his left knee, he understood. He was a hybrid, a shape-shifting being too dangerous. Black flash. Sukuna opened his eyes, all 4 of them, as if there was no tomorrow. Radiating the cursed energy that the teenager was never meant to possess, transcending one step further into the world of sorcerers, Yuji unloaded a direct blow against the King of Curses' face, hitting him with the full force of the black flash, sending him crashing into one of the many ruined buildings in the district. Overwhelmed Sukuna's body with blows to separate him from Megumi. Before Hiromi acts, I must weaken him. Yuki's study of the soul had been something Yuji had learned during that month of calm leading up to the fight, something seared into his mind like a hot iron. Thanks to his time as Sukuna's vessel and his fight against Maldito, the boy knew the edges of a soul, how to strike to widen the fissures and create weakness in Sukuna's current body. And this was the boy's initial plan, and he lunged forward when he saw Sukuna emerge from under the rubble. Opening. Fire erupted majestically. With a motion like shooting an arrow, Sukuna shot the fire at Yuji's figure, intending to burn him alive or at least seriously injure him. He even thought he might, as the boy was advancing towards him quickly without the possibility of dodging the shot, but in a split second, Yuji changed direction by pushing off first with his left leg, which sent him to the right, and then with his right, which returned him to his normal line of advance, evading the fire arrow in a second, and thus allowing him to hit Sukuna with a powerful roundhouse kick that generated a grotesque sound of shattered bones, torn flesh. And the dripping of blood as the boy's hand was torn off with the movement. He went straight for my upper left hand. Sukuna stared at the stump of his left hand with all his might. Blood had spread across the ground and soaked his forearm, creating a truly grotesque sight. But he didn't care. Despite his fight with Satoru Gojo, he would soon be able to recover his lost hand. Why? Do you think I won't be able to cast my techniques like this? You're underestimating me, kid. I have over 1,000 years of experience. And I have nothing to lose. Noble black flash. Yuji directly charged his fists with cursed energy, which erupted with an intensity that left his opponent perplexed for a few seconds. The next second, following the black flash theory, the pink-haired teen generated 2 of these punches in an instant and unleashed a tremendous double blow directly against the King of Curses' lower mouth, causing the flashes to intensify around both of them. Stop this, brat. You can't beat me with punches alone. He swung his arm, slicing through the air. Yuji stomped, braced himself, and turned his head away, letting the scything sickle pass through. But he returned the attack with a hook wrapped in cursed energy that caught his opponent in the chin. I'm going to beat you with what I have. Now, stop. The silent clap generated a ripple of wind. With the King of Curses at the center, the teenager was thrown backward, his body hunched forward, as if he had been punched in the stomach. A second later, when Yuji hit the ground, blood seeped into the fabric of his uniform. Sukuna had generated a crescent-shaped slash to separate Yuji from him, pushing the boy away as he slashed him. Though what he hadn't counted on was the pink-haired teen still standing. He had expected him to split in two like his mentor. I pity you, brat. You try and you can't stop me. Yuji crossed his arms in front of his face, but Sukuna's black flash slammed the boy into the ground. Cracks shook the concrete, raising a small cloud of dust. Stop fighting uselessly and die. Reflexively, Sukuna deflected a projectile headed his way. This gave Yuji time to hit him with a powerful jab straight to the stomach, knocking him backward. They're persistent to a fault. He looked at the blood on his fingers, the blood that had formed when the arrow tried to pierce his temple. With a gesture, he made it fall onto the rubble as he interlaced his fingers. Have you awakened a control over blood? Or is it your idiot brother who's helping you? He didn't respond to the King of Curses' provocations. He assumed his usual combat stance, extending his right arm with a closed fist and covering the side of his face he could cover with his left arm. His eyes never left Sukuna's figure, nor did the pit of his stomach seem to grin sinisterly until he was done. He let the air leave his mouth, forming a small cloud of steam. I don't need Choso to intervene. The cursed energy covered both of the teenager's fists completely. A slightly bluish but very dark coating permeated his limbs, as if they were 2 boxing gloves. When the sound of a rock hitting the ground stopped, they both launched themselves to meet each other. Divergent fist. He extended his arm to its full length for the first blow, and Sukuna saw it. The Higuruma monster blocked the jab with his lower left and upper right arms, unleashing a counterpunch with his lower right arm that connected with the pink-haired boy's stomach. Not content with that, Ryam and Sukuna landed a series of swift punches to the same spot before placing his hand on the boy's stomach and sending a slash against his abdomen, throwing him like a sack of potatoes against rubble. Trying to create talent where there is none. Satoru Gojo was wrong too. Debris flew towards Ryam and Sukuna, who with a gesture got rid of the pieces of the building that were sent towards him. You could shut your mouth and fight. The jacket was ripped. Sukuna's eyes scanned the area he cut, but he saw only skin, torn fabric, and traces of blood. You're wasting energy on a fruitless conversation. I see. Not only have you punched punching bags, but you've also learned the reverse technique. But even so, my interest in you and what you're about to try is scant. He twisted his lips in a mocking sneer. You have no talent. But I will admit that you are too persistent. Not only have I learned about that the bandage that had covered Yuji's face fell at his feet. And Professor Gojo always planned a countermeasure in case he lost a blue orb shone brightly in the teenager's face. I can't just be your vessel, Sukuna. Chapter 21. Sukuna's fingers were, literally, the 20 fingers of the King of Curses. These became cursed objects filled with Ryaman Sukuna's essence when he transferred his own soul into said fingers, dividing his power into 20 equal parts, with no one predominating. It was one of these cursed objects, or rather, fingers, that Yuji Itadori ate to save his companions, transferring the king's consciousness and part of his power into the teenager. Although creating a cursed object seems easy, only one person had been able to recreate them, causing many sorcerers to formalize a pact with him to resurrect in the future, even if it was following his plans. This sorcerer was Noritashi Kamo, the cursed sorcerer, the man who researched the possibility of creating humans' curses through a woman's uterus, giving way to the cursed wombs, and staining his legacy with said action. But this was not the work of the former leader of the Kamo. Kenjaku hatched all the plans, used Noritashi's body as he was using Suguru Jito's, and created the cursed wombs, with the goal of creating a body for Sukuna, a vessel that could bring the King of Curses to life with all his power. And that body was his own son Yuji Itadori, who is, indirectly, Kenjaku's son and a sorcerer with the ability to devour cursed objects and use, to a lesser extent, their powers if necessary. This plan, although complicated, was what led Satoru Gojo to investigate cursed objects, firmly embracing the idea of becoming one and being able to transfer his power to the only student who could use it without repercussions, given the connection they would establish by him being a cursed object and his student the vessel where his power would reside. But it was a bit complicated. Kenjaku had discovered how to turn people into cursed objects, but all the information had disappeared with him. "You're a little crazy, Professor." Yuji had made it clear, with his words, how crazy the plan sounded when it reached his ears. Turning himself into a cursed object to defeat Sukuna when he was defeated. Even he was seeing the problems with said plan, and there were a few of them. If Sukuna defeated Satoru Gojo, why would he, with his powers, be able to beat him? Yuji doubted his teacher was seeing the same thing he was seeing, because he hadn't even flinched when he mentioned his plan. But Satoru Gojo was a proud man, a powerful sorcerer with a certain level of ego that had driven him to devise the plan he was proposing to his student. He had spent the last 2 weeks studying cursed objects, trying to understand how to become a cursed object like Sukuna had, although he was aided by Kenjaku. And finally, he understood how to transfer his consciousness into a part of his body to become a cursed object. There's no need to get so worked up, Itadori-kun. The amused smile spread across the teacher's lips as if it had been drawn with a pencil. The student frowned, sitting there, looking at his teacher smiling as if turning himself into a cursed object wasn't a complicated task, something only his enemy had managed to do. "Do you know anything about souls? You've studied Tsukumo's study, right? The one Choso gave you." The late Yuki Tsukumo, a special grade sorceress who had recently been killed by Kenjaku, had dedicated part of her life to studying souls. The same study that the woman gave to Choso, and he gave it to Yuji in the hope that it would be something important for the war, or at least that's how Yuki had seen it. Yuji had been Ryaman Sukuna's vessel. He'd had a soul inside his body that wasn't his own. Of the current sorcerers, the first year was the one who best understood how souls worked and how to affect them, which was important in order to confront Sukuna inside Megumi's body, since their intention was to separate Sukuna and Megumi and finally get rid of the King of Curses once and for all. Yes, I read it while training with Toji-san. Souls were important in the world of sorcery, but they hadn't been taken into account in 1,000 years. Satoru Gojo understood this as he searched for a way to become a cursed object and pass its powers on to the student in front of him. Good, that shortens the path a lot for you to understand how one can become a cursed object. The sorcery professor had researched everything he could find on how to become a cursed object himself. He had already spoken with Yuta at that time about the boy using his body if he died, but now he was creating more aces up his sleeve. "I've studied how Sukuna became a cursed object, how he transferred his consciousness and power into 20 fingers, giving them the properties of cursed objects and transferring some of his consciousness to them. At first, it was believed that it was the elders and the council who did the work, or at least the 10 sorcerers who faced him. But after Kenjaku's words, his movements and plans, it's clear that he did everything. Written history had been a truth that not even the sorcery professor could change. It had been told, over the course of 1,000 years, that Ryaman Sukuna was defeated by 10 powerful sorcerers, forced to divide the power and consciousness of the Curse King's 20 fingers, separating the fingers and hiding them from any sentient sorcerer or curse, thus keeping Sukuna dead for 1,000 years. And now, all of that was a lie written on paper. Kenjaku had found a way to create cursed objects and make people become them. And that way of doing so was tied to the soul of the person who wanted to become a cursed object, being the most important thing. That was how Sukuna had become a cursed object. dividing his soul into 20 equal parts, transferring his power and consciousness in the same percentage between the parts, giving Kenjaku a future plan which he was currently carrying out without remorse. That's plausible, the teenager's voice brought Satoru out of his thoughts. When Sukuna was inside me, I could feel something else inside of me, as if someone else were inside my body, or as if it were a disguise placed over another body. If Sukuna split his soul into 20 parts 1,000 years ago, the same way he did to possess Fushiguro, it means that just by being aware of their own soul, a sorcerer could become a cursed object without any limitations. That's correct. And that's my plan. I was thinking about Okkotsu or Zenin becoming my vessels, but I don't think it's right. Okkotsu-kun's potential can only be reached when he owns his power, his body, and Rika, so it would be a wasted card. He looked around the room, admiring the Japanese decor. Zenin is a close-quarters fighter without cursed energy, so giving her cursed energy is impossible and would waste her becoming my vessel. That leaves only Sukuna's vessel, the person who assimilated the cursed energy of the King of Curses. Hope settled on Yuji, and the boy felt them on his shoulders like two strong hands pushing him down. He breathed deeply, inhaling and exhaling as if he were hyperventilating, his mind racing, unable to come up with a clear idea or an audible thought. His teacher was pushing him to become a monster. I'd be a monster if I did that, Professor. Oh? Is that so? Satoru laughed dryly. You are a cursed womb, a sorcerer thrust into a restraint that endowed your body with overwhelming physical power and awakened its sealed cursed energy when you shared a body with Sukuna. The definition of monster may be perfect for someone like you in a world like this. However, Itadori-kun, war only has a place for monsters. They are the only ones who survive. The idea proposed by Satoru Gojo was repugnant to someone like Yuji Itadori, who had grown up in a normal world until he decided to change his life by saving his classmates, by devouring the cursed object that turned him into a vessel. But why not be one again? Megumi, his best friend, was being controlled by the monster that had previously been inside him. His friend's sister was murdered while being possessed by someone else. The ordinary world no longer existed. And they were at war. He cracked his knuckles. He let out all the air he was holding in his lungs, creating a hissing sound. He'd gone so far as to spar with a dead man, all in the hope of saving his partner. Yuji's brown eyes stared at the strange blue glow in his teacher's eyes. Both teenager and adult understood that they had created a plan and that they were both walking on the same bridge. Okay, Professor. Explain your plan to me. Satoru Gojo, for the first time, just nodded without smiling. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.